Hi friend, I'm glad you found your way here tonight wherever you are and whatever kind of day led you to this quiet corner of the internet. Settle in, get comfortable and let the rest of your evening slow all the way down. This one is going to be a slow, strange and surprisingly personal story. You have probably always believed that blood is blood, one simple, safe river running the exact same way through every one of us. But here is something modern medicine still cannot fully explain. In around 15 out of every 100 people watching tonight, that river is missing a single invisible marker. Its absence has quietly reshaped royal births, kept thousands of newborns alive, and sparked theories that split serious scientists right down the middle. Some calling it one of biology's last honest mysteries, others insisting it belongs in science fiction. By the end of tonight's journey, you may never look at a simple blood test, a pregnancy checkup, or even a hospital blood bank the same way again. Stay with me because we are about to trace that missing marker all the way back to where the mystery begins. Before we get lost in tonight's story, let me ask for something small. This kind of slow, thoughtful storytelling only keeps finding its way to more people like you when a video does well. So if that sounds like something you would want more of in your evenings, a like or a subscribe helps far more than you might think. A comment costs nothing either, and I look through every single one of them. Tell me where in the world you are tonight and what time it is where you are curled up listening. There is something wonderful about picturing all of you scattered across so many different clocks and time zones, sharing this exact same quiet moment together without ever meeting. Now, if you can dim the lights a little further, let a fan hum somewhere nearby just enough soft sound to make the room feel alive around you. Get comfortable in whatever way helps you listen best. Tonight is a good night to let your body rest even while your mind stays curious a little longer. Tonight is only the first stop on a much longer road. Before we are finished, we will meet the doctors who almost missed one of medicine's strangest discoveries, a small community tucked into the mountains of Europe, whose blood still puzzles scientists today, a cousin species that vanished from the Earth thousands of years ago, yet may share this exact same mystery. And even the wilder theories the internet cannot stop whispering about this very topic. But every long road needs a beginning, and this one has a particularly good starting point. So let us go back, past blood banks, past modern medicine entirely, past the invention of the microscope itself, to a quiet room in Paris more than 400 years ago. Picture Paris in the early 1600s, candlelight instead of electricity, cobblestone streets slick with rain tapping softly against thick glass windows, and grand rooms warmed only by fire and heavy tapestry. Somewhere beyond the walls, the rest of the palace carried on its business, unaware that anything unusual was happening in this particular room. Inside it, a royal midwife named Louise Bourgeois knelt on the floor beside a mother in labour, her sleeves pushed back, a small table of linen, and simple instruments within reach, her breathing steady out of long habit. Bourgeois was not just any midwife. She had delivered the children of the Queen of France herself, Marie de Medici, and her reputation stretched across the entire kingdom. Noble families requested her by name, sometimes sending carriages across the city in the middle of the night to fetch her. She had guided hundreds of births into the world in palaces and in modest homes alike, and by every measure available to her, she believed she'd seen everything childbirth could possibly show her. She was wrong in a way that would trouble her for the rest of her career. The mother that night was carrying twins. The first baby arrived swollen, its small body heavy with fluid it should never have carried, and it did not survive the hour. Shaken but steady, Bourgeois turned her full attention to the second twin. This one seemed perfectly fine at first. Pink. Breathing. Well. The room for a moment allowed itself a little hope, but within days the second infant's skin turned a deep alarming yellow, and its small body began to arch backward, stiff and trembling. By the fourth day, the second twin was gone too. Bourgeois wrote every detail down afterward carefully and without exaggeration. This mattered more than it might sound. In 17th century France, most midwives never learned to put words on paper at all. Bourgeois had, and she was proud of a distinction very few women in her profession could claim. She was, by her own account, the first woman in her line of work to publish her case notes in print, in a thick, careful book that doctors would still be quietly consulting 3 centuries later. Her case survived for a reason that has little to do with medicine at all. She was educated, well-connected, and writing for an audience that included royal physicians. Countless other mothers in countless other centuries almost certainly endured this exact same tragedy, without a single word of it ever reaching a page. History remembers this particular case not because it was rare, but because one woman happened to have the skill and the standing to write it down. Here is what nobody in that candlelit room could have possibly known. Twins sharing the very same mother, the very same womb, the very same blood supply, should have been equally safe or equally in danger together. But blood, it turns out, is not one simple substance shared equally among every member of a family. Sometimes the most dangerous mismatch in the entire human body is not between strangers at all. Sometimes it is between a mother and the child growing quietly inside her. How could a mother's own blood turn against her child? Why would one twin be spared and the other lost, and why did this same heartbreaking pattern keep repeating in villages and in palaces alike for generation after generation, with no healer anywhere able to explain why? For centuries, healers guessed at answers, and most of those guesses aged badly. Some blame the mother's fear or grief during pregnancy, as if sadness alone could poison a child growing inside her. Others blamed bad air, spoiled food, or simple misfortune. A quieter, crueler mistake followed right behind those guesses. In many villages, a mother who lost child after child this way was assumed to be cursed or careless or somehow at fault. It would take science another 300 years and 2 very different doctors working an ocean away from Paris to even begin asking the right question, and to finally clear centuries of mothers of a blame they never deserved in the first place. Maybe it was something in her blood, maybe it was something in his, or maybe in the year 1609 the truest answer is simply that nobody alive could have possibly known. By the time our story picks up again, medicine believed it had already solved the puzzle of blood completely. In 1901, a scientist named Karl Landsteiner had discovered that human blood came in a small handful of distinct groups, later labelled with the simple letters A, B, A, B, and O. It was such a breakthrough that it eventually earned him a Nobel Prize, and it made transfusions dramatically safer almost overnight. By the 1930s, doctors everywhere trusted those 4 letters completely. Match the letters, the thinking went, and the danger was gone. It felt to an entire generation of physicians like one of medicine's oldest and most dangerous mysteries had finally been closed for good. Medicine, it turns out, is a difficult place to feel finished. Now picture a hospital in New Jersey more than 300 years after that candlelit room in Paris in the autumn of 1939. No candles this time. Electric lights hum along a quiet corridor past tired nurses finishing overnight rounds and half-lit rooms where other families sleep undisturbed, unaware of what is unfolding just a few doors away. A 25-year-old woman arrived at the hospital in her 33rd week of pregnancy, doubled over with labour pains and unexpected bleeding. By the next day she had delivered a stillborn baby so small it weighed barely 1 pound and 5 ounces. The bleeding did not stop with the birth, and her doctors had to remove the placenta by hand just to keep her alive through the night. With her strength failing fast, they gave her the safest transfusion medicine could offer at the time, blood from her own husband. 500 millilitres of it. Type O, already trusted by doctors everywhere as one of the safest matches on record, the kind of transfusion performed without a second thought in hospitals across the country. It should have worked perfectly. 10 minutes after the transfusion finished, she was shaking with chills, her head and legs aching in a way no one in the room could explain. Her obstetrician, a doctor named Rufus Stetson, sent a sample of her blood to a colleague named Philip Levine. a researcher with a quiet talent for asking uncomfortable questions other doctors had learned to stop asking. A month of careful testing later, Levine had an answer that made no sense at all by the medical rules of his time. Her blood reacted against her husband's blood, and it reacted against 80 out of every 100 other type O donors he tested it against, as if her own body had quietly decided that most of her own blood group was the enemy. Doctors eventually found 6 donors whose blood her body would accept just enough to save her life. But 6 out of so many tried was a strikingly small number, and in 1939 nobody could yet explain why. This kind of reaction was not entirely without precedent, at least in the animal world. Veterinarians already knew that cattle, chickens and rabbits could develop something similar after repeated transfusions, their bodies slowly rebelling against blood forced into them again and again. But this woman had never received a transfusion before that night in her life. Whatever had trained her body to fight so fiercely had not come from a needle. It had come from somewhere else entirely, and at the time only one other case anything like it had ever been written down in medical literature. Levine had a hunch, and it was a radical one for his time. He proposed that sometime during her pregnancy, her unborn baby had passed something into her bloodstream, something inherited from the father, something her immune system had never met before and did not recognize as safe. Her body, doing exactly what a healthy immune system is built to do, had learned to fight it quietly the same way it might learn to fight off a common illness. If Levine was right, the implications were almost too strange to say out loud in a hospital corridor. It meant a mother's own child could, through no fault of anyone in that room, become a kind of biological stranger inside her own body. It meant the 4 familiar letters doctors had trusted since the turn of the century, the same letters that had felt like a finished chapter of medicine, could not explain why 2 people who were supposedly a perfect match had reacted like enemies on a hospital bed. So what was this invisible ingredient? Where had it come from? And why had a Paris midwife working 330 years earlier, with nothing but candlelight and careful handwriting, seemed to be describing this very same invisible enemy in a different country in a different century with none of Levine's instruments? The real difference between Bourgeois and Levine was never intelligence. Both were careful, both were patient, both trusted what they observed with their own eyes over what tradition told them to believe. The only thing standing between them was 330 years of missing tools and a single unanswered question passed quietly down through generations of mothers who never got to hear it answered. Levine could not fully prove his answer yet. Neither could Stetson. Maybe the invisible ingredient came from the father's side of the family exactly as Levine suspected. Maybe it was something else entirely still hiding in plain sight, waiting for better instruments to reveal it. Or maybe, and this humbled even the most confident doctors in that New Jersey hospital, human blood held far more secrets than anyone in 1939 was fully ready to admit. Here is the part that might surprise you more than anything else tonight. Somewhere between 15 and 17 out of every 100 people listening to this story right now are carrying that very same invisible difference in their blood this very moment while you rest here in the dark. Not a disease, not a flaw, just a quiet marker. Most of you have never been told the full story of sitting patiently in your veins, the way it has sat in countless veins before yours, through countless quiet nights just like this one. It is the reason a nurse asks a certain question before every blood donation. It is the reason some pregnant women receive a small ordinary injection almost nobody stops to ask about. It is even the reason certain hospital refrigerators guard a particular bag of blood a little more carefully than the rest. And by the time we reach the end of tonight's story, you will understand exactly why and exactly what your own blood has been quietly carrying all along. 14 generations of mothers came and went between that candlelit room in Paris and that hospital bed in New Jersey, all of them carrying the same unexplained mystery quietly in their blood, and not one of them ever got to hear its name. Keep that pattern in mind as tonight unfolds. A confident answer quietly undone by someone patient enough to keep looking. A mystery declared solved right up until the one case that refuses to fit. It does not end with Levine and Stetson, it barely even begins there. And to finally understand what that invisible marker actually is, the thing that connected a stillbirth in Paris to a transfusion reaction in New Jersey, across more than 3 centuries we have to travel one more time, not to a palace this time and not to a hospital, but to a laboratory and a monkey that never once asked to have its blood compared to yours. That laboratory sat inside the Rockefeller Institute in New York City, and by the time our story reaches it, a full year had passed since that New Jersey hospital room. It was 1940 now, and the man at the centre of this next chapter was someone we have already met, though not quite like this. Karl Landsteiner had officially retired the year before. On paper, he was done. In practice, retirement for a man built the way Landsteiner was built mostly meant keeping the same laboratory bench and simply dropping the title. He was in his 70s by now, still arriving early, still hunched over test tubes with the same restless curiosity that had once earned him a Nobel Prize for sorting human blood into its basic groups. That was not even the only mystery he had already solved in his long career. 3 decades earlier, working alongside a colleague named Erwin Popper Landsteiner, had proven that a terrifying disease that paralyzed children, a disease doctors of the era barely understood, was actually caused by a virus rather than bad air or poor hygiene, as many still assumed at the time. Blood groups and paralyzing childhood illness could not have seemed further apart as puzzles, and yet here was one aging scientist who had quietly cracked both. Beside him in the Rockefeller laboratory worked a very different kind of scientist. Alexander Wiener was only 23 years old, a Brooklyn-born son of a Russian immigrant lawyer, the kind of prodigy who had graduated high school at 15 and won mathematics scholarships before he ever thought seriously about medicine. He solved equations for fun-played piano well enough to impress dinner guests, and carried a memory for small detail that would later make him one of the most sought-after expert witnesses in American courtrooms. Landsteiner brought decades of instinct honed across an entire career. Wiener brought a young mathematician's obsession with precision. It was by almost every account an unusually productive pairing. Together, this unlikely pair turned their attention to a stubborn question left hanging in the air since that transfusion reaction in New Jersey. If a mother's body could learn to fight something inherited from the father, something no letter of the alphabet had ever accounted for, then that something had to be a real physical substance. Landsteiner and Wiener set out to find it, and their method was almost shockingly simple. They drew blood from a rhesus monkey, a small quick-tempered primate common in laboratories of the era, and injected it into a series of rabbits kept in simple wire cages along one wall of the laboratory. The rabbits' immune systems did exactly what immune systems are built to do. They recognized the monkey blood as foreign and produced antibodies to fight it off. Days later, Landsteiner and Wiener drew blood from those same rabbits, separated out the clear serum and mixed drops of it, with samples of ordinary human blood pulled from donors around the institute, simply to see what would happen under a simple glass slide and a basic laboratory microscope. What happened surprised even them. The rabbit serum did not just react to monkey blood. It reacted violently with the vast majority of human blood samples too, clumping the red cells together in a way easy to see under a simple microscope. Roughly 85 out of every 100 human samples reacted. The other 15 did not react at all. Here was a factor hiding in human blood all along that nobody had ever been able to see before, because nobody had ever thought to look at human blood through the lens of a monkey's immune system. Landsteiner and Wiener needed a name for it, and rather than inventing something complicated, they simply named it after the animal that had revealed it to them, the rhesus monkey. The factor became known almost overnight as the rhesus factor. It is worth pausing here to ask a question worth asking about most scientific breakthroughs, not just this one. Was this really the same invisible enemy that had attacked the mother in New Jersey the year before? On paper, the numbers lined up beautifully. Roughly 15 out of every 100 people lacked this new rhesus factor entirely, and 15 out of every 100 was almost exactly the group doctors would soon associate with the kind of dangerous pregnancy complications Levine had been chasing. Case closed, or so it seemed to almost everyone paying attention in 1940. Almost everyone. Because science has a funny habit of rewarding the people who keep asking questions after everyone else has already decided the answer. What if the substance a rabbit's immune system reacts to in a monkey's blood is not automatically the exact same substance a human mother's immune system reacts to in her own child's blood? What if two completely different biological signals discovered a year apart by two different research teams using two entirely different methods had simply been assumed to be identical because the numbers happened to rhyme? Nobody in 1940 was equipped to answer that question. The tools to look that closely simply did not exist yet. Maybe the rabbit and the mother really were reacting to the exact same invisible marker as everyone assumed. Maybe they were reacting to two different markers that happened to travel together in most human bodies, similar enough in behavior to be mistaken for twins. Or maybe, and this is the answer that would eventually prove closest to the truth, the whole naming story was built on a coincidence nobody would be brave enough to question again for decades. Before we go further into that particular twist, let me ask you something, since we are already well into this story together tonight. Has your mind started wandering yet toward your own blood type, wondering quietly which side of that 15% you might fall on? If you happen to already know the answer, let me know down in the comments along with how you found out. A routine checkup, a pregnancy, a donation drive, or maybe a curiosity you never quite resolved until right now. Keep that question in the back of your mind either way. We will come back to it more than once before tonight is finished, and by the final chapter it might mean something different to you than it does right this moment. For nearly 20 years, the scientific world treated the rhesus factor as a single tidy discovery closed and settled. Textbooks were rewritten within a matter of months. Hospitals adopted new testing protocols almost immediately because a discovery this useful for preventing dangerous pregnancies and transfusion reactions was far too valuable to sit on, while academics quietly argued over technicalities behind closed doors. Millions of patients across dozens of countries were tested, classified, and treated based entirely on Landsteiner and Wiener's rabbit experiment, a piece of laboratory work that had taken in total only a matter of weeks to complete. For 2 full decades it worked well enough in practical terms that almost nobody thought to look under the hood again. Good enough, it turns out, has a way of quietly disguising itself as finished. Then researchers doing more careful, more painstaking serological work in the 1950s and 60s started noticing small inconsistencies that refused to disappear no matter how many times they repeated their tests. A handful of patients reacted in ways the original rabbit-based model simply could not explain. Blood that should have agglutinated did not. Blood that should have stayed calm reacted anyway. These were not massive contradictions. They were tiny, stubborn cracks, the kind most scientists would have been tempted to dismiss as laboratory error. But careful researchers do not dismiss stubborn cracks. They dig into them. And what they eventually found, painstakingly over years of additional study, was almost too strange to believe. The antibody that rabbits produced against rhesus monkey blood was not actually targeting the same molecule that caused the dangerous reaction in human mothers and newborns. It was targeting something related, something that travelled alongside the true culprit in most human bodies, similar enough to be mistaken for it for 20 years, but genetically and structurally its own separate thing entirely. In other words, Landsteiner and Wiener had accidentally discovered a real and useful marker in human blood. They had simply misidentified exactly which marker it was. The true culprit behind the New Jersey case, the actual antigen a mother's body learns to fight during a dangerous pregnancy, turned out to be a distinct molecule altogether, one that simply happened to correlate closely enough with the rabbit-based test that nobody noticed the difference for 2 full decades. Here is where this story gets almost funny in a quiet human sort of way. By the time scientists fully untangle the mistake, the name rhesus factor had already been printed in thousands of medical textbooks, stitched into hospital paperwork on every continent, and taught to a full generation of doctors and nurses as unquestioned fact. Renaming it accurately would have meant rewriting an entire branch of medicine's vocabulary from scratch. So medicine did what institutions often quietly do when a name has already taken root too deeply to dig up. It kept the wrong name and simply agreed to understand it correctly going forward. The original rabbit-reacting substance eventually earned its own separate name, tucked quietly into specialist textbooks. Most people outside the field will ever open, honouring Landsteiner and Wiener, directly for the antigen they had actually found. Meanwhile, the word rhesus stayed attached permanently in every hospital, every blood bank, and every pregnant patient's chart on the planet to a discovery it never technically described in the first place. There is something almost comforting about that if you think about it long enough. Science rarely gets handed to us in one clean, finished piece. It usually arrives first as a rough, useful approximation good enough to save people immediately, and only later gets quietly sanded down into something more precise. One careful correction at a time by people patient enough to keep questioning an answer everyone else had already stopped doubting. It turns out the rhesus factor was never really one single thing to begin with either. As researchers kept digging through the decades that followed, they uncovered an entire family of related markers sitting side by side on the very same stretch of human genetic material, at least 5 major ones working together in different combinations, plus dozens of smaller, rarer variations layered on top of those. Being rhesus positive or rhesus negative, it turns out was never really a simple yes or no question. It was closer to a short genetic sentence, a specific combination of letters passed down from both parents, almost as individual as a fingerprint. Wiener himself, ever the meticulous mathematician, spent years building an entire naming system just to keep track of all the different combinations a single person's blood could carry. A system doctors in some parts of the world still lean on today. What began as a single missing puzzle piece turned out to be an entire puzzle box nobody had realized they were holding. Wiener's talents, as it happens, reached well beyond the laboratory. His careful, exacting mind made him one of the most trusted expert witnesses of his era. Called into courtrooms across New York to settle disputed paternity cases and eventually violent crimes using nothing but a few careful drops of blood. In 1935, years before the world even knew the full story behind his most famous discovery, Wiener helped draft the very state law that first allowed blood evidence into New York courtrooms. His reputation for solving mysteries with a test tube grew strange enough and famous enough that the Mystery Writers of America eventually made him an honorary member, a rather delightful footnote for a man whose day job mostly involved staring at rabbit serum under fluorescent light. Carl Landsteiner never got the chance to see how thoroughly his own discovery would be corrected, and in a way that feels almost fitting for a man who spent his entire career chasing questions rather than settling for answers. On a summer afternoon in 1943, 3 years after that rhesus monkey experiment, he suffered a heart attack while working at his laboratory bench, reportedly with a pipette still in his hand. He died 2 days later in the very hospital attached to the institute where he'd spent the better part of his career. He was 75 years old, and by every account from colleagues who knew him, still working exactly the way he'd worked his entire life right up until the very end. 3 years after his death, the scientific community awarded its highest honor for clinical research jointly to 3 names that had never all worked in the same room together: Carl Landsteiner, Alexander Wiener, and Philip Levine, the very doctor whose careful testing in that New Jersey hospital had started this entire chain of discovery in the first place. 3 men working from 3 different starting points in 3 different laboratories, chasing what turned out to be the same invisible thread running quietly through human blood. an obstetrician who trusted a strange transfusion reaction enough to send it to a specialist instead of writing it off as a fluke, a mathematician's son with a talent for noticing details other people rushed past, and an aging immigrant scientist who refused to let retirement slow down a career built entirely on refusing to accept easy answers. None of them set out to name a mystery that would still be unraveling more than 80 years later. They simply kept asking the next honest question one after another until an answer finally held. So here is where tonight's story actually stands a little over 3 decades into a mystery that will eventually stretch back tens of thousands of years before we are finished tonight. We now have a name for the invisible marker at the center of everything, even if that name turned out to be something of a happy accident. We know roughly how many of us carry it and how many of us do not. What we still have not answered is the harder, sadder question underneath all of this. What actually happens inside a mother's body when that marker turns her own immune system against the child she's carrying? Why does it take a second pregnancy, almost always, before anything goes wrong at all? And just how many families in the years before anyone understood any of this quietly lost children to a mystery with a name nobody had thought to give it yet? That is where we are headed next. Not into another laboratory this time, but into the quiet, heartbreaking mechanics of what actually happens, cell by cell inside a mother's body, once that fight begins into a disease that would eventually earn one of the strangest names in all of medicine, and into a far clearer picture of just how many families were caught silently in the gap between discovery and understanding. So let us answer that question properly, because it deserves a real answer rather than a passing mention. Why does the body wait? Why does a first pregnancy so often pass by peacefully, while a second or a third carries so much more danger? Think of the immune system for a moment as something closer to a very cautious guard than a violent one. The first time it encounters something unfamiliar, it does not attack immediately with full force. It studies the intruder first, slowly building a rough, clumsy first line of defense out of large, bulky antibody molecules, one simply too big to slip through the wall, separating a mother's bloodstream from her unborn babies. That wall, the placenta, does its job well during a first pregnancy, in most cases filtering nutrients through in one direction and keeping most of that first oversized defense safely on the mother's side of the barrier. The real danger rarely comes from 9 calm months of pregnancy at all. It comes from birth itself, in the final chaotic minutes when the placenta finally detaches and a surprising amount of the baby's blood slips across into the mother's own circulation for the very first time, often in a single brief, unnoticed moment nobody in the delivery room would think twice about. That is the moment her body finally meets the stranger properly, often within a matter of minutes in a room full of people focused entirely on the newborn, and never once suspecting anything was happening inside the mother at all. And once her body has met that stranger, it does not forget. Ever. Picture a woman named Margaret in a small town that could have existed almost anywhere across the last 3 centuries, raising her first child without a single complication worth mentioning to the doctor. A healthy pregnancy. An ordinary, exhausting, joyful delivery. A healthy little girl, red-faced and loud-handed, straight into her arms. Nothing about that first birth would have warned a single person in the room that anything unusual was happening beneath the surface. But somewhere in the mess and blood of that ordinary delivery, a small amount of her daughter's blood crossed into her own bloodstream, carrying a marker her body had never once encountered before. Quietly, over the weeks that followed, while Margaret was busy learning how to be a mother, her immune system was doing something of its own. It was studying that marker, filing it away, and slowly building a proper, lasting defense against it. The kind of defense a healthy immune system builds only against threats it fully expects to meet again one day. 2 years later, Margaret became pregnant a second time. This time, her body was not meeting a stranger. It was meeting an old, well-documented enemy, and it responded the way a seasoned guard responds to a face already on file. This second wave of defense was smaller, faster, and most dangerously small enough to slip straight through the placenta and into the baby's own bloodstream months before birth ever arrived. By the time this second child was born, if it was born at all, the damage had often already been done quietly for weeks inside the womb itself. Multiply Margaret's story by as many families across as many centuries as you can imagine, and the true scale of this becomes almost too large to sit with comfortably. In the United States alone, in the years just before modern treatment finally caught up with this disease, doctors were losing somewhere near 10,000 infants a year to it. Not 10,000 over a decade, 10,000 in a single year, year after year in one country alone from a cause almost nobody watching their child struggle could have named. Here is the reversal worth sitting with for a moment. Most people assume danger builds gradually a little worse with each pregnancy from the very start. The truth is closer to a switch than a slope. The first pregnancy is very often the safest one a woman in Margaret's position will ever have, precisely because her body has not yet learned who the enemy is. It is the second meeting that is dangerous, not the first, and that single detail confused physicians for a very long time. If you're watching this tonight and you happen to know your own family's pregnancy history, this might be the moment a few old half-remembered stories start rearranging themselves into a clearer picture. An aunt who lost a baby only on her second try, never her first. A grandmother who always said her younger children arrived weaker than the ones who came before them. Stories like that were passed down for generations as simple bad luck or as a kind of family curse whispered about at gatherings. Most of the time they were neither. They were biology quietly repeating a pattern nobody in the family had ever been given the language to describe. Why would a mother's own body treat her second child so differently from her first? Why did some families lose child after child in exactly this pattern, while neighbours with seemingly identical circumstances never lost a single one? And why, for so many centuries, did doctors keep treating the outcomes of this one hidden process as if they were describing 3 or even 4 completely unrelated diseases? That last question turns out to matter more than it sounds like it should. For hundreds of years, physicians who delivered a baby swollen with fluid, one who never took a breath, wrote it down as one disease, giving it its own formal name, hydrops fetalis, meaning simply universal swelling of the unborn. Physicians who watched an apparently healthy newborn turn a deep, dangerous yellow within days, sometimes stiffening and arching backward the way the second of bourgeois twins once had called that an entirely different disease with its own separate name, icterus gravis, meaning grave jaundice. And physicians who noticed a newborn was simply mysteriously pale and weak, without swelling or jaundice at all, filed that under yet a third name, altogether plain anemia of the newborn. 3 separate diagnoses, 3 separate chapters in 3 separate sections of the same medical textbooks. Nobody connected them because on the surface, dressed in 3 such different costumes, they simply did not look remotely related to one another. Maybe these really were 3 unrelated tragedies that simply happened to cluster around the same unlucky families by coincidence. Maybe one was caused by something in the mother's diet, another by a defect of the heart, a third by some infection nobody could ever quite isolate under a microscope. For a long stretch of medical history, respected physicians argued for every single one of those explanations in print with real conviction, because nothing in front of them suggested otherwise. Or maybe, and this is where the story's about to turn, all 3 were the very same fire, simply caught at 3 different stages of burning, waiting for someone patient enough to notice the smoke came from one source. In 1932, a young pediatrician at Boston's Children's Hospital named Louis Diamond sat down with his mentor, a physician named Kenneth Blackfan, and did something almost nobody had thought to do before. Instead of studying each condition separately the way every textbook of the era instructed, they lined the case histories up side by side on the same desk and looked for a common thread running quietly underneath all 3. Diamond had an unusual path into medicine himself. Born in Ukraine, brought to the United States as a small child of only 2 years old, raised in Manhattan by parents who had crossed an ocean, for the chance he worked his way through Harvard University taking odd jobs to pay for his tuition, and fell in love with pediatrics almost by accident while spending a summer working as a camp counselor for children years before he ever wore a white coat. By the time he reached Boston's Children's Hospital as a young resident, he had already developed a habit that would define his entire career. He refused to accept that a diagnosis was finished simply because it had a name. What Diamond and Blackfan found once they finally looked closely enough changed the way an entire branch of medicine understood newborn disease. Underneath every one of these supposedly separate conditions, in every single case they examined under the microscope, the infant's bloodstream was flooded with an unusual number of immature red blood cells that should never normally circulate outside the bone marrow at all, let alone in such staggering numbers. The baby's body, it turned out, was fighting a desperate full-scale emergency manufacturing new blood cells, faster than any newborn body should ever need to, so much faster that the liver and the spleen were forced to join the effort, swelling in the process, taking over blood production, the way a factory might convert every available flaw to a single urgent order: high drops, severe jaundice, dangerous anemia. All three, Diamond and Blackfan, finally realized were simply different faces of one single underlying disaster, arriving at different speeds and different severities depending on how much of the fight had already happened before birth. Severe enough in some cases to end a pregnancy as early as 17 weeks along. Gentle enough in others to look at first glance like nothing more than a slightly yellow newborn who would surely brighten up by morning. They gave this newly unified disease a name built directly from what they had found under the microscope. Those immature red blood cells were called erythroblasts, and so the disease became erythroblastosis fetalis, a name that sounds intimidating until you realize it simply means exactly what it describes: a fetus whose blood is full of cells that should not be there yet. Here is what makes this discovery quietly remarkable. Diamond and Blackfan solved this puzzle 7 full years before Philip Levine ever tested that transfusion reaction in New Jersey, and 8 years before a monkey in a laboratory in New York lent its name to the cause. They knew with total certainty that these 3 conditions were one disease long before anyone on Earth understood why it was happening. They had correctly diagnosed a fire without yet knowing what had struck the match. If you go back now to that candlelit room in Paris more than 3 centuries before Diamond ever picked up a microscope, something remarkable happens. The first of Louise Bourgeois' twins swollen and gone within the hour, and the second jaundiced and arching stiffly by the 4th day, were never 2 separate tragedies happening to share one unlucky night. They were the exact same disease wearing 2 different masks playing out in front of the one woman in the entire kingdom skilled enough to write it down. There is a quiet lesson tucked inside this part of the story that has little to do with blood at all. Sometimes the hardest part of solving a mystery is not finding a treatment. It is simply agreeing on what you are actually looking at in the first place. Diamond and Blackfan never touched a single antibody or antigen. They did not cure anyone. What they did was look at 3 tragedies everyone else had already filed neatly away under 3 separate names and refused to accept that the filing system made sense. Diamond did not stop at naming the disease. He went on to build one of its first real treatments years before anyone knew the underlying cause involved a missing marker in the mother's blood at all. Working with a colleague named Fred Allen in the autumn of 1946, Diamond performed what came to be called an exchange transfusion, threading a thin catheter into the tiny vessels of a newborn's umbilical cord and slowly, patiently withdrawing a small amount of the baby's damaged blood, replacing it with healthy donor blood. A few careful teaspoons at a time over hours, sometimes over several days, until enough of the dangerous antibody-coated blood had been swapped out to give a struggling infant a genuine chance to recover on its own. He performed the procedure using a length of specially manufactured rubber tubing. The manufacturer, as it happened, had produced far more tubing than Diamond had actually ordered. reasoning that since the machines were already running, he might as well make extra while he was at it. Diamond spent the years that followed travelling from hospital to hospital across the country, and eventually overseas teaching the procedure to anyone willing to learn, handing out lengths of that same leftover tubing along the way, almost like a man quietly distributing a small miracle out of the trunk of his car. Death from this disease, once nearly a certainty in its most severe form, dropped more than tenfold wherever the technique took hold. It was not a cure. Nobody could yet stop the underlying process from beginning in the first place, and the treatment itself was exhausting, risky and available only in hospitals wealthy enough to have a physician willing to learn it. But for the first time in recorded medical history, a baby caught inside this invisible war had a genuine fighting chance of walking out the other side of it, and that alone was worth more than most quiet medical footnotes ever get credit for. So here is where that leaves us. If you have been keeping track of the different pieces we have gathered so far tonight, quietly stitching one century into the next in your mind the way I have been stitching them together in this room, we know the disease finally has a single correct name. We know roughly why the danger tends to wait for a second pregnancy rather than a first, and why so many old family stories about weaker younger children were never really about luck at all. We know a treatment existed imperfect and exhausting, as it was decades before anyone fully understood the cause behind it. And if you happen to carry that same invisible marker we talked about earlier tonight sitting quietly in your own blood, right now you're carrying a small direct thread connecting you to every one of these names: Bourgeois, Levine, Landsteiner, Wiener, Diamond. What none of these brilliant, careful people had figured out yet, not Levine, not Landsteiner and Wiener, not even Diamond himself, was how to reach a baby who was still inside the womb, still weeks away from being born while there was still time left to help. That question would not find its answer in a laboratory at all. It would find it inside an operating room in the most literal sense imaginable on the other side of the world, from Boston and New Jersey, both where one doctor was about to attempt something so unlikely that even his own colleagues quietly assumed at first that he had simply lost his mind. Auckland, New Zealand sits about as far from Boston and from New Jersey as 2 points on this planet can reasonably sit roughly the opposite side of the globe from either one, and that distance matters for this next part of the story. The man about to change everything had almost no contact with any of the researchers we have already met tonight, no shared laboratory, no overlapping conference. Nothing but the same stubborn mystery arriving on his side of the world a full generation later. He built his own path to it from a completely different direction, and in a strange way that distance made him exactly the right person to take the next impossible step. His name was William Liley, and medicine did not start out as his obvious calling at all. He trained first as a physiologist, spending his early career studying how nerves communicate with muscles, working as a postgraduate researcher under a demanding Australian neurophysiologist named John Eccles at a research institute in Canberra, work about as far removed from pregnant mothers and unborn babies as a career in medicine can possibly get. It is worth noting, since this story loves a coincidence, that Eccles himself would go on to win a Nobel Prize for that very research into nerve signalling in the same year, 1963, that his former student across the ocean was quietly making a different kind of history, entirely one with far less fanfare in Stockholm and far more consequence in a delivery ward. It was not until the late 1950s that Liley shifted his attention toward obstetrics, taking up a research post at a maternity hospital in Auckland. Colleagues who knew him during those years described someone who approached a pregnant woman's body less like a doctor treating one single patient, and more like an engineer studying a system with two separate occupants, each deserving careful individual attention. That distinction, small as it sounds, turns out to be the whole story of this next chapter, and it is worth holding on to as we go, because everything that follows tonight grows directly out of it. Before Liley could ever think about treating an unborn baby suffering from this disease, he first had to solve a much quieter problem. How do you even know while a baby is still inside the womb how sick that baby actually is? You cannot listen to a heartbeat and tell severity the way a thermometer would. You cannot take a blood sample from someone who's not been born yet, not easily, not in the 1950s. What Liley eventually discovered was that the fluid surrounding the baby, the amniotic fluid itself, carried a faint chemical signature of the fight happening just beyond it. As damaged red blood cells broke down inside the baby, a yellowish pigment leaked out and slowly made its way into that surrounding fluid, the same pigment responsible for the jaundice bourgeois had watched overtake her second twin centuries earlier, only now visible in a laboratory sample instead of a newborn's skin. Liley worked out that by drawing a small amount of amniotic fluid with a fine needle and measuring with surprising precision exactly how much of that pigment it carried, he could build a fairly accurate picture of how much danger the baby inside was actually in weeks before delivery ever arrived. He turned that insight into a simple chart, plotting fluid readings against the number of weeks a pregnancy had progressed, and dividing the results into 3 colour-coded zones of rising concern from mild watchfulness at one end to immediate danger at the other. For the very first time, doctors had something near to a window into a hidden battle they had never once been able to observe directly before, a way of listening in on a conversation happening entirely in the dark. It was in its own quiet way a small miracle of a discovery, the kind that rarely makes headlines because it saves nobody directly. It only helps doctors see more clearly. And it very nearly stayed exactly that. A way to watch a tragedy unfold in slow motion with still no way to reach in and stop it. Here is where the story takes the turn that makes it worth telling at all. During one of these routine sampling procedures, guiding a needle carefully through a pregnant woman's abdomen toward the fluid surrounding her baby, working blind with no moving picture to follow, only careful calculation and a steady hand, Liley missed. Not by very much. Just enough that the needle, instead of finding open fluid, slipped instead into the baby's own small abdominal cavity. Most physicians in that moment would have felt a jolt of alarm, withdrawn immediately, and moved on quietly grateful nothing worse had happened. Liley, by every account of the people who worked alongside him, had a different reaction entirely. If a needle could reach the baby by accident, he found himself wondering, was there any reason in principle one could not reach the baby on purpose? Ask yourself for a moment whether you would have had the nerve to follow that thought any further than a passing curiosity, or whether relief alone would have been enough to send you straight back to the safer, already accepted way of doing things. Most people, even most excellent doctors, would have filed the whole episode away as an interesting accident, written a cautious note in the chart, and returned to safer ground for the rest of their career. Liley did not, and historians of medicine still debate exactly why. Maybe it was simple stubbornness, the same quality that had once kept him chasing nerve signals nobody could see either. Maybe it was that unusual training as a physiologist, first a habit of mind that never quite accepted the wall. Most physicians kept between watching a problem and reaching into it. Or maybe, and this is probably the more honest answer, some people are simply built to keep turning an accident over in their hands long after everyone else in the room has already put it down and moved on. What if the very fluid causing all this danger, the mother's own antibodies quietly crossing over to us attack her baby's blood, could be answered directly inside the womb itself by giving that baby exactly what it needed most? Fresh, healthy, compatible blood delivered not after birth, the way Diamond's exchange transfusion had managed a generation earlier, but while the baby was still weeks away from ever taking a first breath. Colleagues who heard Liley describe this idea out loud did not react the way people react to a promising new theory. Several of them, by his own later account, quietly assumed he had lost his mind. Operating on a fetus still inside its mother's body, using nothing but a needle and a set of ordinary X-ray images for guidance, in an era before real-time ultrasound existed, anywhere in medicine sounded to most of his peers less like medicine and more like a particularly reckless kind of magic trick, performed on 2 patients at once, either of whom could be lost in the process. He tried anyway. His first attempt failed. So did his second. So did his third, each case its own quiet private grief carried mostly alone. Each of those 3 losses would have been for almost anyone else more than sufficient reason to shut the file for good, to write the idea up as an honest failure and quietly move on to safer research. Somewhere in Auckland, after each of those 3 attempts, William Liley sat with the kind of disappointment that does not show up in any published paper, and decided each time to try once more. Picture what those 3 failures must have cost him both professionally and personally in a hospital culture, where a 4th attempt at something this unconventional would have been an easy thing for any ethics committee to simply forbid. But in September of 1963, on his 4th try, it worked. The technique itself, once he had refined it, sounds almost impossibly delicate for the era in which it happened, closer to blind archery than to modern surgery. With no way to see directly inside the womb, no moving picture of any kind, Liley taped small metal paper clips onto the mother's skin as simple markers, then took a still X-ray image and used it to calculate by hand exactly where the baby's abdomen sat beneath the surface at that particular moment. Guided by nothing more precise than that single calculation, he passed a needle through the mother's abdomen, through the wall of the womb, and into the fluid-filled space around the baby's own internal organs, where he could slowly draw fluid out and replace it with concentrated, carefully matched red blood cells. The blood sitting there in that small internal space would gradually be absorbed into the baby's own circulation over the following days, the way water is slowly drawn up through the roots of a plant, quietly restoring a blood supply that disease had been stripping away for weeks, one patient a needle length at a time. Here is a question worth sitting with, since we're already well past the middle of tonight's story together. What do you think mattered more in that first successful case? The needle or the nerve to use it a 4th time after 3 failures? Most people would have taken as a clear and final answer. The very first successful case worked well enough that the child went on to survive a pregnancy doctors had expected to end in loss. News of the procedure spread quickly through medical circles, and before long, well beyond them, into ordinary newspapers, onto radio broadcasts, into the kind of dinner table conversation medical journals rarely ever reach. This was not simply a new treatment. It was an entirely new idea about what an unborn baby even was, medically speaking, and it arrived with real risk attached, since a single miscalculated needle could just as easily harm the very patient it was meant to save. For the whole of recorded medical history up to that point, a fetus had essentially been treated as a part of the mother inseparable from her own body, and her own chart worth protecting only by protecting her. Liley's needle quietly argued something different, that the person growing inside a mother's body was, in a very real and practical sense, already a second patient in the room, one who could be diagnosed, monitored, and now treated directly independent of anything happening to the mother herself. That single shift in thinking would eventually reshape enormous parts of medicine that have nothing to do with blood disease at all, opening the door to an entire field that did not even have a proper name yet at the time. Doctors would later come to call it fetal medicine, and today it covers everything from surgery on babies with heart defects to treatments for conditions nobody in 1963 had even learned to diagnose before birth. Liley is widely remembered as the person who almost by accident gave that entire field its first real foothold. It is a strange kind of legacy to leave behind, changing the definition of who counts as a patient, using nothing more than a needle that went slightly off course. The early results, in honesty, were far from perfect. Roughly 4 out of every 10 of these initial transfusions succeeded in Liley's first years, performing them a survival rate that would sound alarming by today's standards, but represented an enormous leap forward for babies who without any intervention at all faced almost certain loss. That success rate climbed steadily as surgeons around the world learned of the technique, travelled to observe it firsthand and slowly refined it over the following decade. exchanging notes across oceans the way Liley himself had once been separated from his own colleagues by exactly that same distance. Eventually, the survival rate rose high enough that intrauterine transfusion became a standard, reliable part of care, for even the most severe cases of this disease performed in ordinary hospitals by ordinary specialists who had never once had to invent the idea from nothing. There is something worth pausing on here, a small thread connecting this chapter back to the very first minutes of tonight's story. 350 years after a French midwife first watched 2 newborns die from a disease, nobody had a name for a doctor on the far side of the world finally reached one of those babies while there was still time left to act, not after birth, but before it. It took 3.5 centuries to finally bridge that particular gap. And in the end, it was closed not by a grand government program or a well-funded research team, but by one accidental needle, 3 quiet failures, and one doctor stubborn enough to ask an uncomfortable question a 4th time in a hospital where most of his colleagues had already stopped expecting an answer. New Zealand fittingly still keeps his memory alive in its own quiet way. A National Medical Research Award has carried his name since the early 2000s, given each year to researchers whose work echoes the kind of careful, occasionally uncomfortable curiosity that led Liley to a needle, an accident, and an idea nobody else in the room was quite ready to take seriously. His fellow physicians eventually came around to honouring him with fellowships on both sides of the Atlantic, and in one particularly unlikely footnote, inviting him to join a centuries-old scientific academy in Rome, despite the fact that Liley, by his own description, did not hold any particular religious belief at all. Apparently a mind willing to reach directly into the womb earns a certain kind of respect regardless of which institutions eventually come calling. If you happen to be one of the roughly 15 out of every 100 people watching tonight who carry that same invisible marker we've been tracing since the very beginning. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment. Every single advance in fetal medicine that exists today, every ultrasound-guided procedure now considered routine in hospitals around the world, traces its lineage back through a needle that missed its intended mark in a hospital in Auckland more than 60 years ago now. Medicine rarely announces its true turning points in advance. Most of the time they arrive disguised as a small mistake nobody was quite prepared to walk away from. None of this remarkable, as it was actually stopped the disease from happening in the first place. Liley had found a way to fight the fire once it started, sometimes successfully, sometimes not at real risk to both mother and baby with every single attempt. Somewhere else entirely, other doctors were already asking themselves a very different kind of question. Not how to treat this disease more bravely once it had already begun, but whether there was any way to stop a mother's body from ever declaring war on her own child in the first place. That question would not be answered with a needle at all, and it would not be answered in Auckland or in Boston or in New Jersey. It would be answered with something far smaller, and in its own way even stranger, a quiet injection that would eventually come astonishingly near to erasing this entire disease from the modern world altogether. That quiet injection has a beginning almost too ordinary to belong in a story this dramatic. No dramatic accident this time, no candlelit tragedy, no needle slipping off course into unexpected territory. It began instead with a tired doctor doing something almost embarrassingly unglamorous, reading a pathology textbook. In 1958, a young physician named John Gorman was running the blood bank at a hospital connected to Columbia University in New York, an Australian by birth who had crossed an entire ocean to build his career in American medicine. His days were spent doing the unglamorous essential work of keeping a hospital blood supply organized, and safe cross-matching donors tracking inventory, the kind of steady background labour that keeps a hospital running without ever making headlines. Late one evening, working through routine professional reading most people in his position would have skimmed and quietly forgotten. By morning, Gorman came across a single sentence that stopped him cold. Buried in an otherwise unremarkable passage of an ordinary pathology textbook, the author noted almost in passing that the presence of certain antibodies already circulating in someone's blood could quietly suppress that same person's own immune system from ever mounting a proper response to that exact target again in the future. Gorman looked at that sentence again, then a third time. If that principle held true for the disease he watched destroy families in his own hospital, it suggested something almost too strange to say out loud to a room full of skeptical colleagues. The cure for a disease caused by dangerous antibodies might be of all things more antibodies. Here is a question worth turning over in your own mind for a moment before we go further into how this actually played out, since I suspect most of us would answer it differently than we would like to admit. If you were a doctor in 1958 and a colleague suggested treating an antibody-driven disease by deliberately injecting a patient with more of that exact antibody, would your first instinct be curiosity, or would it be to quietly, politely back out of the room and let someone else take the risk? Gorman didn't back out of the room. He brought the idea to an obstetrician named Vincent Frieda, a colleague at the same hospital who saw firsthand week after week exactly what this disease cost the families in his own waiting room. Together, the two of them began chasing down a reliable source of the antibody itself, eventually finding their way to a researcher named William Pollock, working for a pharmaceutical company just across the river in New Jersey. 3 men, 3 completely different specialties, 3 different employers with 3 different sets of incentives, and 3 different bosses to convince quietly building toward the same improbable idea from 3 separate directions. Gorman understood the blood. Frieda understood exactly what the pregnant patients in front of him stood to gain or lose from getting any part of this wrong. Pollock understood how to actually manufacture and refine a raw antibody into something pure stable and safe enough to inject into a healthy human being without causing new harm in the process. Let us slow down for a moment because the actual mechanism behind this idea deserves more than a passing mention, and it is worth understanding properly rather than simply accepting it on faith. When a mother's immune system meets her baby's blood for the very first time, usually during delivery, it does not attack immediately. It studies the intruder first, the way we described earlier tonight, slowly building a lasting permanent defense, meant to recognize that same intruder again in any future pregnancy. What Gorman's team proposed was almost sly in its simplicity, the kind of solution that sounds obvious only after someone else has already thought of it. If you flood the mother's bloodstream with a carefully measured dose of ready-made antibody immediately after delivery before her own body has time to organize a proper response of its own, that borrowed antibody quietly hunts down and clears away the baby's leftover blood cells first. It does the mother's immune system's job for it quickly and quietly, then leaves before that immune system ever gets a proper look at what it was supposed to be fighting. No target left to study. No lasting memory ever formed. The war that would have started quietly in the weeks that followed simply never gets the chance to begin at all. It sounds on paper like fighting fire with fire, the kind of idea a cautious review board might reject on instinct alone before reading past the first sentence. In practice, it turned out to be closer to clearing away the evidence before an argument could even start, a strange, elegant trick of biology. Nobody had thought to attempt on a pregnant human patient before this particular team dared to try it. Maybe the idea would work exactly as the textbook passage suggested, a tidy solution, hiding in plain sight for years before anyone noticed it. Maybe something about human pregnancy messier and more individual than any laboratory condition would prove different enough from wherever that original observation had come from to make the whole plan quietly fall apart the moment it met a real patient. Or maybe, and this was the honest answer nobody could give with any real certainty. In 1958, the only way to actually find out would be to try it on a real person, brave enough to volunteer for something that had never once been attempted on a human being before, that someone turned out to be family. On the 31st of January 1964, the very first injection of this experimental antibody went to a woman considered at risk of the disease. She happened to be John Gorman's own sister-in-law. Sit with that detail for a moment because it tells you something honest about scientific confidence that no published paper ever quite manages to capture. Gorman was not simply testing an unproven theory on a stranger somewhere down the hospital corridor, someone whose face he might never see again. He was staking his own family's safety, and by extension a piece of his own conscience, on a mechanism he had first stumbled across nearly 6 years earlier alone late at night in the pages of an ordinary reference book nobody else in that hospital had thought twice about. The trial that followed grew far beyond one hospital in New York. 42 separate clinical centres scattered across the United States, Great Britain, Germany, Sweden, Italy and Australia, all began quietly testing the same approach on real patients, tracking results by ordinary mail and long expensive telephone calls, comparing notes across an ocean in an era long before anyone could simply send data by electronic message in an instant. And in a detail that says something quietly wonderful about how science actually moves forward, a separate research team working entirely independently in England, led by a physician named Cyril Clarke, had already been chasing the exact same idea through experiments of their own for several years, arriving at strikingly similar conclusions from the opposite side of the Atlantic. Neither team was copying the other, and neither seems to have known at first how far along the other one had gotten. Both had simply followed the same quiet textbook thread to the same improbable door at roughly the same moment in history an ocean apart. Here is the moment worth pausing on, since we are deep enough into tonight's story now that a pattern should be starting to feel familiar. This is the third time we have watched a handful of stubborn, curious people chase an idea that sounded, at first hearing, almost reckless. Levine with his transfusion mystery, Liley with his misplaced needle, now Gorman reading a textbook sentence most physicians would have turned past without a second thought. By 1968, after years of careful trials spread across 6 different countries and countless nervous conversations between researchers and ethics boards, the treatment finally received official approval in the United States, sold under a brand name built directly from its own purpose, a shortened nod to the rhesus factor it had been designed to neutralize. A fixed, remarkably simple dose given within 3 days of delivery, cheap enough to manufacture in bulk and straightforward enough that any hospital in the country could administer it without special training. A woman named Marianne Cummins from a small town in New Jersey, the same state where William Pollock had spent years refining the very antibody she needed, was pregnant with her 3rd child. She'd already carried 2 rhesus-positive babies safely, remarkably still unsensitized, which meant this 3rd pregnancy was statistically the one most likely to finally turn dangerous. She'd come across news of the medication's approaching approval sitting at her own kitchen table in an ordinary newspaper article most readers would have turned past without a second thought. There was one small, agonizing problem. Her due date fell several days before the drug's official release date. Rather than simply hoping for the best, she spent the final stretch of her pregnancy on the telephone with regulators and her own physician, pressing for early access to a medication that had at that point barely left the laboratory. When it finally became available, she received her injection within hours, becoming the very first woman in the country to be treated under full official approval hours after giving birth to a healthy son. Within roughly a year, more than 500,000 women had received the same injection. Think for a moment about the strange nature of that particular kind of success. Nobody could point to 500,000 people visibly saved the way you might point to a rescued swimmer or a successful surgery. The entire achievement was invisible by design, measured only in tragedies that quietly stopped happening, families who never learned how near they had come to losing something, doctors who never had to deliver news they had once delivered constantly. Death and permanent injury from this disease, the very tragedy that had quietly haunted families since a candlelit room in Paris more than 3.5 centuries earlier, began falling toward numbers so small that an entire generation of young doctors training in wealthy countries would eventually go through their entire careers without ever personally treating a single case of it. Notice, if you will, how different this particular breakthrough feels from everything we have covered so far tonight. Diamond gave sick babies a fighting chance after the war inside them had already begun. Lily reached directly into the womb to treat a battle already well underway. This one is different in a way that matters. It does not treat the disease at all. It simply makes sure the war never gets declared in the first place closer to a peace treaty, signed before either side even knows there was ever anything to fight about. There is something worth sitting with honestly here rather than simply celebrating a happy ending and moving straight on to the next story. This kind of quiet triumph rarely reaches everyone equally, and this one did not either. Even now, more than 60 years after that first cautious injection reached John Gorman's own sister-in-law, researchers estimate that roughly half of the women around the world who need this same simple, inexpensive shot still do not reliably receive it, mostly in regions where routine prenatal blood testing and a steady, uninterrupted medication supply remain far from guaranteed. Several international medical groups have spent recent years specifically organizing around closing that exact gap, treating it less as a solved problem from the 1960s and more as unfinished business still very much in progress. The disease that nearly vanished from wealthy hospitals never actually vanished from the planet itself. It simply became invisible to those of us fortunate enough to be somewhere it had already stopped being common. 12 years after that first cautious trial in 1980, the four people most responsible for this breakthrough, Cyril Clarke, John Gorman, Vincent Frieda and William Pollock together, received one of medicine's most prestigious research honours, presented at a ceremony that by every account felt more like a quiet family reunion than a formal award dinner. If that sounds familiar, it should. A different earlier trio connected this exact same story. Landsteiner, Wiener and Levine had received essentially the same honour decades before them for finding the problem in the first place rather than solving it. It is a strange, quiet symmetry running through this entire mystery, one this storyteller finds truly moving every time it comes up. Almost every major breakthrough in this particular saga eventually earned the same kind of formal recognition, decades apart, awarded to people who mostly never worked in the same building together, chasing the exact same invisible thread from wildly different directions, decades and oceans apart, and somehow always arriving at roughly the same conclusion. If you are one of the many people watching tonight who happens to be pregnant or who has ever been pregnant, or whose mother sat through a prenatal appointment decades ago without a second thought about a routine injection offered somewhere around the 28th week here, is where that small, unremarkable moment finally gets its full explanation. That is this. That is the very shot we've been building towards since the first few minutes of tonight's story, the one almost nobody in the waiting room ever stops to ask about, because it has worked so quietly and so well for so long that it stopped looking like a miracle and started looking like paperwork. We have spent a great deal of tonight inside hospitals, laboratories, and delivery rooms following individual doctors chasing individual patients through individual crises, each of them convinced in their own moment that they were the ones finally closing this particular chapter for good. But there is a much stranger, much older question sitting underneath all of it that we have not touched even once tonight. Every discovery so far has explained how this marker behaves, how it is inherited, how it can be treated, and how it can now largely be prevented. Nobody has yet explained why it exists at all. Why of all the places on this earth does one small, isolated community tucked into a mountain range in Europe carry it in numbers found almost nowhere else on the planet, high enough to make hematologists a continent away raise an eyebrow every time the subject comes up? That question will not be answered in a hospital either, and no injection, no needle, and no laboratory will help us get there. It will take us somewhere far older than any of the laboratories we have visited tonight, to a language nobody outside its own speakers can quite explain, and a people nobody has ever fully managed to place, no matter how many centuries they have spent trying. A people nobody can quite place is a strange thing to say about a group of Europeans who have made their home in the exact same mountains for longer than almost anyone can measure. But that is precisely the reputation that follows the Basque people. Wherever their history gets discussed, and once you understand why the reputation starts to make a great deal of sense, tucked into the western edge of the Pyrenees, straddling the border between modern Spain and France, sits a region where a woman named Amaya, tending sheep on a steep green hillside the way 3 generations of her family did before her, might greet you in a language that sounds like nothing else spoken anywhere on the entire European continent. Linguists have spent well over a century trying to trace Euskara, the Basque language, back to some larger family tree the way German connects to English or Spanish connects to French hunting, through old manuscripts and border villages for even a single distant cousin. Nobody has ever managed it. Euskara simply sits there alone, quietly refusing every attempt to give it relatives. Most serious researchers now believe it may be one of the last surviving fragments of whatever languages were spoken across the whole of Europe before farmers from the east arrived thousands of years ago, carrying an entirely different family of languages that eventually swallowed almost everything standing in its path the way a flood eventually reaches even the driest corner of a valley. Almost everything that flood swallowed. Not quite everything. There is a reason I keep circling back to Amaya and her flock on that hillside rather than leaving her in the opening sentence and moving straight to statistics. The same isolation that kept her language intact for thousands of years, the mountains that made her valley inconvenient for armies and merchants and empires to bother crossing, did not simply protect a handful of words and songs. It protected an entire population's blood quietly, without a single person involved ever knowing that was happening. Nobody in Amaya's family tree ever set out to preserve a rare genetic pattern. They were only ever trying to keep their sheep fed and their language spoken in a place too steep and too stubborn for the rest of Europe to fully absorb. Here is where the story crosses back into blood, because language was not the first clue that something unusual was happening in this particular corner of Europe. Decades before anyone had heard of the rhesus factor at all, researchers surveying ordinary blood types across the continent kept running into a strange statistical wall the moment their sampling reached the Basque region. More than half of the population carried type O blood, a rate high enough to stand out sharply on any map of Europe. In Seoul, one of the smallest and most linguistically isolated Basque provinces, tucked deep enough into the mountains that its own dialect of Euskara survived more fully intact than almost anywhere else that number climbed higher still. Type B, meanwhile, was almost nowhere to be found at all, a genuine rarity in a group surrounded on every side by populations where it turns up at ordinary, unremarkable rates. Long before anyone had a single genetic tool sharper than a microscope and a careful notebook, this sparked a great deal of speculation among the researchers doing the counting. If the Basques carried unusually high rates of type O blood, and so did certain populations scattered across Ireland, Scotland, Corsica and Crete places, with no obvious shared history and no shared language whatsoever, did that mean some ancient forgotten connection ran quietly between all of these seemingly unrelated corners of Europe? Letters crossed borders between research institutes that rarely corresponded otherwise. Theories were floated in academic journals, some considerably more careful than others, a few frankly closer to guesswork dressed up in scientific language. For years that question simply sat there mostly unanswered, an interesting coincidence, with no obvious explanation attached to it yet. Then in 1940, the very discovery we spent an entire chapter of tonight's story tracing back to a laboratory, a rabbit and a rhesus monkey, gave researchers an entirely new tool to test with one. Nobody surveying blood across Europe in earlier decades had ever had access to. And when blood samples from the Basque region were finally screened for this newly discovered factor, the numbers did something almost nobody involved had actually expected going in. They did not simply confirm an already unusual population and quietly move on. They revealed one of the single most extreme genetic outliers found anywhere on the entire planet, a statistical anomaly striking enough that it would go on to be cited in genetics textbooks for the rest of the century. Ask yourself for a moment what it would actually take to convince you that a single, small population was truly meaningfully different from its neighbours, rather than simply an ordinary statistical blip that would smooth itself out with a larger sample. One unusual number could reasonably be written off as chance, but could two completely independent traits discovered decades apart using two entirely different scientific methods, both pointing with striking consistency to the exact same tiny mountain population, still be dismissed as coincidence with a straight face? Roughly a quarter to a third of the Basque population carries no rhesus factor at all, compared to somewhere around 15 out of every 100 people across most of the rest of Europe. In some of the most isolated valleys studied over the decades, that number has been reported climbing even higher, well beyond anything found in any other population researchers have ever measured on Earth. Layer that finding on top of the earlier discovery about type O blood, and something even more specific comes into focus. Close to 27 out of every 100 Basques carry the particular combination of type O and rhesus, negative together, a pairing so rare almost everywhere else in the world that hospitals treat it as one of the single most valuable and hardest to stock blood types on their shelves. This is not a small deviation. This is not statistical noise easily explained away by a limited sample size. This is one people occupying one relatively small corner of one continent, carrying a version of human blood that stands apart from every population surrounding it on every single side. Here is the reversal worth sitting with for a moment, because it is remarkably easy to let a story this striking run away from the actual evidence behind it, and this particular mystery has attracted more than its share of casual exaggeration over the years. Popular retellings of the Basque blood story love to quote a single dramatic number, often somewhere near 45 or even nearing 50%, as though every Basque grandmother alive today tests rhesus negative on the spot without exception. That figure is real, and it comes from legitimate genetic research. It simply measures something slightly different than most casual retellings ever bother to explain. It reflects the underlying frequency of the genetic variant itself counted across every copy of the gene circulating in the population, rather than the actual percentage of people who show up rhesus negative when a nurse draws their blood in an ordinary clinic. The number of Basques who actually test negative, roughly a quarter to a little over a third of the population depending on which particular valley you happen to be standing in, is already remarkable enough without anyone needing to round it up for effect. Sometimes the honest, careful version of a mystery is plenty strange on its own, without any extra decoration hung on top of it. So where does a difference this extreme actually come from? For most of the last century, the leading explanation among anthropologists ran something like this. Long before farming ever reached Europe, the entire continent was home to small scattered bands of hunter-gatherers, moving with the seasons, leaving behind little more than stone tools and the occasional painted cave wall. Then, starting somewhere around 10,000 years ago, waves of farmers began arriving steadily from the east, bringing wheat livestock, and eventually entirely new families of language along with them. Across most of Europe, these newcomers gradually mixed with, absorbed, or simply outnumbered the older hunting populations already established there, blending genetics and language together into the patchwork of nations we recognize on a map today. The traditional story holds that the Basque region, protected by mountains too steep to farm easily, and valleys narrow enough to defend, never fully joined in that blending the way everywhere else eventually did. A pocket of considerably older Europe, the theory suggests, survived quietly tucked inside a much newer one, its language and its blood both standing as leftover evidence of a world that had mostly disappeared everywhere else on the continent. It is a wonderful story, the kind that fits neatly into a single paragraph and a single satisfying picture. It also turns out to be on closer inspection a little too neat for its own good. Recent genetic research, working with tools far more precise than anything available even 20 years ago, sequencing whole ancient genomes rather than guessing from a handful of markers, has started gently complicating that tidy picture. Ancient genetic material recovered from skeletons scattered across the wider region shows that Basque ancestry did receive real, measurable genetic input from those farming migrations, just as every other European population eventually did. The difference was never total isolation, a sealed door nobody ever walked through. It was something considerably subtler than that. Comparatively less mixing with one specific later wave, the Indo-European speaking herders who swept across most of the rest of the continent several thousand years after the first farmers combined with the kind of slow, quiet genetic drift that happens naturally inside any smaller population that keeps mostly, though never completely, to itself for a very long stretch of time. Calling the Basques untouched time capsules from the Ice Age, a phrase that shows up constantly in older popular writing on this exact subject, takes a truly interesting scientific truth and stretches it into something closer to a folk tale than a finding. Maybe the honest answer is that isolation alone explains the pattern. Mountains and steep valleys quietly limiting who married whom, generation after generation, century after century, until small chance differences in blood type simply had enough room and enough time to grow larger than they ever would have on an open plain. Maybe there is something else entirely still hiding underneath the genetics, some quiet advantage this particular blood profile once offered in this particular landscape that nobody has fully identified or proven. Yet the way the toxoplasma research we will get to later tonight hints might be true elsewhere. Or maybe, and this is the answer most serious geneticists actually favour today when pressed for a straight answer, both forces were working together the entire time, isolation and chance reinforcing one another slowly, for thousands of quiet years, with neither one doing the whole job alone. The Basques are not entirely alone in carrying this particular pattern either, and that detail matters more than it might seem at first hearing. Across the water in North Africa, in the Rif and Kabylia regions of the Atlas Mountains, certain Berber populations carry rhesus negative rates well above the surrounding North African average too, somewhere in the range of 15 to 20 out of every 100 people, still noticeably lower than what shows up in the Pyrenees, but far too high to write off as ordinary. Rather than undermining the Basque story, that detail actually strengthens it considerably. It suggests this entire pattern has less to do with anything mysteriously unique to Basque genetics specifically, and rather more to do with what tends to happen quite generally to any human population that spends enough centuries relatively isolated along Europe's western and southern edges, mountains at their back and open coastline in front of them, while the rest of the continent kept absorbing wave after wave of newcomers arriving steadily patiently from the east century after century for thousands of years running. If you happen to have Basque ancestry yourself, even a small distant thread of it tucked somewhere in your family tree, there is a real chance you're carrying a genetic signature that traces back further and survived more intact than almost anyone else watching tonight. If a home genetic test has ever handed you a small, unexplained percentage next to a region of Spain or France you'd never given much thought to before, this might be the moment that number finally starts making a little more sense. Somewhere in a village small enough that everyone still recognizes each other's last names in language classrooms, where children are still taught a tongue that predates nearly every other language spoken in Europe today, that same blood keeps quietly circulating generation after generation, largely unbothered by several thousand years of continental history sweeping past just outside the mountains. I will admit something here, since it feels like the honest thing to do partway through a story like this one. Of every population we will visit tonight, the Basque case is the one that makes the tidy single-sentence explanation hardest to hand you with a straight face. Not because the mystery is unsolved. Highly capable researchers have mapped this pattern from nearly every angle available to them. It is simply that the honest answer resists being wrapped up, neatly made up instead of isolation. Chance, geography, and time all leaning on each other at once, none of them doing quite enough alone to explain the whole picture by itself. If you came here tonight hoping for one single tidy cause, Amaya's blood is not going to hand you one. It is going to hand you 4 or 5 reasons all working together quietly for thousands of years. We have now spent a full chapter tracing one people's blood back through language mountains and migration, watching a single small population turn out to be far stranger and far more carefully studied than a first glance would ever suggest. But the questions this raises reach back much further than any of that. Further than farming. Further than the arrival of language families sweeping across a continent. All the way back, in fact, to a different species of human being entirely, one that stopped existing somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years ago, yet somehow almost impossibly still shows up quietly in blood, being tested in laboratories today, including in a way none of us fully expected until fairly recently in blood that might belong to someone watching this exact video right now. That different species of human being spent roughly 260,000 years walking across an entire continent hunting, raising children, and by every archaeological sign available to us burying their dead with something that looks remarkably like care. Then somewhere between 30 and 40,000 years ago they quietly disappeared. We are talking of course about the Neanderthals, and for most of the last century, everything we thought we knew about their blood came from little more than educated guessing dressed up as science. For most of the 20th century, entire museum exhibits were built around little more than careful guesswork dressed up in confident placards. That kind of guessing became almost entirely unnecessary starting around 2010 when a Swedish geneticist working out of a research institute in Germany finally accomplished something the scientific community had spent decades quietly assuming was simply impossible. The kind of project senior colleagues gently discourage a young researcher from wasting a career chasing. He sequenced an actual Neanderthal genome extracted from bone fragments, tens of thousands of years old, degraded by time, contaminated by soil bacteria, and handled by countless human hands over the decades before anyone had the tools to properly interpret them. That same researcher went on to identify an entirely new branch of ancient humanity most people had never heard of before the Denisovans, built almost entirely from the genetic material inside a single small finger bone found deep in a cave in Siberia. His work eventually earned him a Nobel Prize in medicine, an unusual honor for someone who spends most of his working life examining bones rather than patients. And more importantly for tonight's purposes, it handed every researcher who came after him an entirely new set of tools to ask increasingly specific, increasingly strange questions about people who vanished tens of thousands of years before anyone thought to write anything down at all. One particularly striking piece of follow-up research arrived in 2021 inside a laboratory in France, run jointly by a national scientific institute, a university in Marseille, and the French National Blood Transfusion Service, an unusual partnership pairing paleoanthropologists with the exact kind of hematologists who spend their ordinary working days quietly managing modern hospital blood supplies, rather than studying vanished species. Their subject was not an actual patient at all and never had been. It was a set of already sequenced genomes painstakingly extracted years earlier from ancient bone fragments belonging to 3 Neanderthal women who had existed somewhere between 100,000 and 40,000 years ago, and one individual from that same more recently discovered more mysterious branch of ancient humanity, the Denisovans. Ask yourself something for a moment before we go any further into what this team actually found. If you were handed genetic material tens of thousands of years old, fragile, degraded, contaminated by centuries of cave sediment, and the careless fingers of everyone who touched that bone before proper handling protocols existed, what would you even think to look for first? Most people understandably imagine hair color or height or facial structure, the kind of details that make for a good museum reconstruction behind glass. This particular research team, a mixture of paleoanthropologists and blood specialists, who do not often find themselves working from the same set of notes, or attending the same conferences, or frankly speaking quite the same professional language, asked a considerably stranger and considerably more clinical question anyway. They wanted to know what blood type these ancient relatives of ours actually carried, the same information a hospital would want from you before a transfusion extracted instead from people who died tens of thousands of years before hospitals existed at all. For decades, the working assumption inside anthropology had settled into something almost too tidy to question. Chimpanzees, our closest primate relatives alive today, are essentially all one blood type. Gorillas are essentially all another. Following that same simple logic, most researchers had long assumed Neanderthals were probably all type O as well, a single uniform blood type running quietly through an entire vanished species, tidy enough to fit into one line of a textbook. That assumption turned out to be wrong, and not by a small margin either. When this particular team finally examined the relevant genetic regions closely enough to actually check rather than simply extrapolating from our primate cousins, they found something considerably messier and considerably more human than almost anyone in the field had expected going in. Neanderthals and Denisovans carried nearly the full range of ABO blood type variation, still found circulating in people alive today. Not one tidy type shared uniformly across an entire species the way a textbook illustration might suggest. A genuine untidy spread type A, sitting alongside type O, sitting alongside type B, roughly the same kind of variety you would find quietly sampling blood across any ordinary modern city on any ordinary afternoon. Here is where the story turns from mildly surprising into something considerably closer to the spine of everything we have spent tonight tracing. Among the 7 different blood group systems this team examined, one in particular deserves your full attention, since you already know exactly why it matters. Buried inside the Neanderthal genetic code, researchers found specific variants of the very genes responsible for the rhesus system, the same genes at the center of every single story we have followed tonight so far. And these were not neutral, harmless variants sitting quietly in the background, the genetic equivalent of an interesting footnote. In modern humans, the exact same gene variants found circulating in these ancient Neanderthal genomes carry a well-documented, thoroughly studied association with high risk of the very disease we have spent this entire evening tracing generation after generation, from a candlelit room in Paris to a hospital bed in New Jersey to a needle in a delivery ward in Auckland. Sit with the implications of that for a moment, because they reach further back than almost anything else we've covered tonight. Neanderthals and our own species overlapped in both time and territory, for thousands of years met, and we know for certain today sometimes had children together. If you happen to be of non-African ancestry yourself, a small percentage of your own genetic code, commonly cited at around 1 to 2%, is quietly Neanderthal in origin at this exact moment, a detail Pairbo's research made possible to actually measure rather than merely suspect. Now push that same fact 1 generation further back. If a Neanderthal mother carried a child fathered by a member of our own species, or by a Denisovan partner, and that child inherited a rhesus profile incompatible with her own, in exactly the way we have spent all night describing, her body may have quietly turned against that pregnancy in precisely the same fashion described by a French midwife working 400 years ago. Except this time, tens of thousands of years earlier, on the other side of an entire species boundary, with absolutely nobody anywhere on the planet capable of understanding why. Here is a question worth turning over slowly rather than rushing past. Could a disease this specific, this narrow, this dependent on one small genetic mismatch between a mother and her unborn child have actually played a quiet role in why an entire species of ancient humans eventually stopped existing? Researchers are careful, and rightly so, not to hang the entire disappearance of the Neanderthals on this single mechanism alone. Extinction on this scale almost never traces back to one clean headline-friendly cause. Climate shifted, sometimes dramatically, across the exact centuries when Neanderthal numbers were already thinning. Competition for resources with our own rapidly expanding species almost certainly played some meaningful role as well. Neanderthal populations, as this same genetic research also independently confirmed, were already small and thinly scattered across an enormous territory, carrying noticeably less genetic diversity than the humans steadily expanding into their range of vulnerability entirely on its own, regardless of any single disease sitting quietly in the background. But researchers studying this particular rhesus finding do believe reduced reproductive success from exactly this kind of maternal-fetal incompatibility, quietly repeating across generation after generation of interbreeding between closely related but genetically distinct human populations, deserves a real serious seat at that table, one contributing factor among several, rather than something to be waved away entirely. Maybe this particular incompatibility mattered enormously quietly, chipping away at every generation of hybrid pregnancies until the numbers simply could not hold. Maybe it was a smaller contributor one thread in a much larger rope made of climate competition and shrinking population size, all pulling in the same direction at once. Or maybe, and this is the honest position most careful researchers actually hold today, we will never know the precise weight this single factor carried against everything else working against an entire species at the exact same moment in history. There is one more detail from this same research worth sharing before we move on, because it closes a loop in a way that feels almost too poetic to be real, and yet it happens to be entirely verifiably real. Buried within these ancient Neanderthal genomes, researchers identified one particular rhesus gene variant that did not simply vanish along with the species that once carried it. That same variant quietly passed down through countless generations of interbreeding and migration, spreading slowly across an ocean over tens of thousands of years, has been traced directly into the genomes of specific present-day populations in Australia and Papua New Guinea. Living people walking around this exact planet, today going to work, raising children of their own, carrying a fragment of Neanderthal blood chemistry that has survived, essentially unbroken, since long before the pyramids, long before agriculture, long before anything we would recognize as history had even begun. The rhesus finding was not the only surprise buried in that particular genome either, though it is the one that matters most for tonight's purposes. The same research also turned up ABO-related genetic variants still present in some populations alive today that appear to offer real protection against certain viral infections of the gut, a small but genuine survival advantage quietly riding along inside a blood-type system most of us only think about when a nurse asks which letter belongs on our chart. And when the team traced the broader genetic patterns across all 7 blood group systems, they examined the results consistently pointed toward the same deep African origin for both Neanderthals and Denisovans. That other lines of evidence had already suggested blood group genetics working in its own quiet way, as one more thread confirming a story pieced together from bone stone tools and climate records long before anyone thought to check what these ancient relatives' blood actually looked like. Here is the strange quiet thread connecting every single chapter of tonight's story back to this exact moment, all the way to this exact laboratory in France. The gene family responsible for a French midwife's tragedy in 1609, written down by candlelight in a language considerably older than modern French. The same family a rabbit's immune system accidentally helped a retired scientist and his young Brooklyn-born partner identify in 1940. The same family responsible for one small mountain population tucked into the Pyrenees carrying blood found almost nowhere else on the continent. All of it belongs to a genetic system considerably older than our own species, one that was already complicated, already carrying real consequences for real families, long before anyone alive today, or their grandparents grandparents had ever been born, and quite possibly long before our own species had fully finished becoming what we are now. If you happen to be rhesus negative yourself, here is something worth carrying with you for the rest of tonight's story, long after this particular chapter ends. You're not simply missing a modern medical marker that a handful of 20th century researchers in laboratories in New York and New Jersey happened to identify with a rabbit and a microscope. You're carrying one small present-day piece of a genetic story that predates our entire species, tangled up with cousins of ours who stopped existing tens of thousands of years before recorded history, even began in ways scientists using tools barely 15 years old are still carefully, patiently working out today, one ancient genome at a time. There is a particular kind of humility worth sitting with here, and I will admit it caught me off guard the first time I properly understood it while researching tonight's story. We have spent the last several minutes discussing an entire vanished species using nothing but genetic material extracted from a handful of bone fragments. 4 individuals representing an entire population that once stretched across a continent are currently doing the work of representing everyone who ever existed and died as a Neanderthal. It is remarkable that we can learn anything at all from so little. It is also worth remembering quietly how much of this story likely still remains completely unknown to us, waiting in caves nobody has excavated yet, or in genomes too degraded for even today's remarkable tools to interpret. Take a moment, if you like, before we move into the next part of tonight's journey, and simply notice how strange it feels to have spent the last several minutes discussing the medical history of a species that has not existed for tens of thousands of years, using the exact same vocabulary we used earlier tonight for a hospital in New Jersey. That more than almost anything else in this entire story is what makes this particular blood type such an unusual thread to pull on. It refuses to stay inside any single century. Which brings us finally to the single question this entire evening has been quietly building toward from the very first minute we spent together tonight. If this particular genetic variation has been causing real measurable reproductive harm for tens of thousands of years, in more than one species of human being stretching back long before Paris, long before New Jersey, long before any doctor anywhere had a name for any of it, why has it not simply been erased by evolution long ago? The way a computer deletes a corrupted file, why does something carrying a real documented biological cost still exist at all? Quietly in you and me, in roughly 15 out of every 100 people listening to this story unfold in the dark tonight, tens of thousands of years after it first started causing exactly this same kind of trouble in a species that no longer even exists to feel its consequences. Evolution as a rule is not a sentimental process, and it does not tolerate expensive mistakes for very long. A trait that costs an animal real chances at survival or reproduction tends to fade out of a population within a manageable number of generations, quietly edited out by the same blind patient process that built it in the first place. Which makes the puzzle sitting at the center of tonight's story truly strange, because by every rule, evolutionary biologists normally rely on the rhesus negative trait should not still be here. Let us do the uncomfortable arithmetic properly, because it deserves a clear accounting rather than a vague gesture toward mystery. Before the medical breakthroughs, we spent earlier chapters of tonight tracing a rhesus negative mother carrying a rhesus positive child faced a real measurable generation after generation cost. Second children, and every child after that carried genuine risk of loss or lasting harm. Multiply that risk across tens of thousands of years across every single generation, Since this variation first appeared somewhere back near the ancient relatives we spent the last chapter discussing, and simple mathematics suggests something should have happened to it by now. The rarer version of this gene should have been slowly, quietly erased from the human population over time, the same patient, unglamorous way countless other costly mutations have been erased throughout our species' long history, one disadvantaged pregnancy at a time, generation stacked on generation. It was not erased. Roughly 15 out of every 100 people on this planet still carry it today, in some regions considerably more than that. Evolution appears on the surface at least to have simply declined to do its job, leaving a costly trait sitting quietly in circulation for far longer than the textbooks would generally predict. Here is a question worth sitting with honestly for a moment before we go any further. When a pattern this stubborn refuses to disappear despite a real cost attached to it, what does that usually tell a careful scientist? Rarely does it mean evolution made an oversight. Far more often it means there is a second cost or a second benefit, quietly balanced on the other side of the scale, one nobody has bothered looking for yet. There is a well-known example from an entirely different corner of genetics that makes this exact principle considerably easier to picture, and it is worth walking through properly before we return to blood type. Carrying a single copy of the gene responsible for sickle cell disease offers real, measurable protection against malaria, one of history's most relentless killers, across much of Africa and parts of Asia, even though carrying 2 copies of that same gene causes a serious, sometimes fatal blood disorder in its own right. 2 copies of the ordinary gene, no protection against malaria at all. 2 copies of the sickle cell version, a dangerous disease. But exactly 1 copy of each, the heterozygous middle ground. Most people never think to consider quietly outperforms both of the alternatives in regions where malaria remains a constant threat. Evolution in that particular well-studied case kept the rarer gene circulating for exactly this reason, balancing 1 cost against 1 benefit with a precision no human engineer could have designed on purpose. Biologists call this heterozygote advantage, and it remains one of the oldest, best documented tricks evolution has ever pulled on a stubborn disease. Could something similar, some quiet trade-off nobody had thought carefully enough to look for, be happening with rhesus negative blood as well? For decades most researchers simply assumed not, and reached instead for a quieter, considerably less satisfying explanation whenever the question came up at all. Isolated populations, small founding groups, random genetic drift, slowly nudging a rare variant up or down in frequency, with no advantage attached to it at all, purely by chance, the way we discussed happening inside one particular mountain range earlier tonight. Chance alone, most textbooks suggested, was explanation enough. One stubborn Czech evolutionary biologist working out of Charles University in Prague was never entirely satisfied with that answer, and colleagues who know him describe someone with a healthy, career-long tolerance for asking questions most of his field had quietly agreed to stop asking. His name is Jaroslav Flieger, and his career has spent a considerable, occasionally eyebrow-raising amount of time studying something almost nobody outside parasitology thinks about with any regularity at all. A single-celled parasite called Toxoplasma gondii, one of the most successful, most widespread parasites on the entire planet, quietly infecting an estimated 1 out of every 3 human beings alive on this planet today in its latent, usually symptomless form, a number large enough that the person sitting next to you tonight, if anyone is, has a real chance of carrying it right now without either of you ever knowing. Most people carrying it never know. It arrives through contaminated food, through unwashed hands after gardening, and famously through contact with cats, the only animal in which the parasite can complete its full reproductive cycle. For most healthy people, the infection settles quietly into the brain and muscle tissue and stays there indefinitely, causing no obvious symptoms at all, no fever, no fatigue, nothing a routine checkup would ever flag. If you have ever owned a cat, cleaned a litter box, or eaten a slightly undercooked piece of meat at a barbecue, you probably shouldn't ask too many questions about. There is a real unremarkable chance you're one of the roughly 1 in 3 people quietly carrying this exact parasite tonight entirely unaware. No obvious symptoms, Flieger began arguing, does not necessarily mean no effect whatsoever. Working with colleagues over the course of several careful studies, Flieger's research team began measuring something specific in people known to be carrying latent toxoplasma infections: reaction time. The simple, measurable speed at which a person responds to an unexpected stimulus. The kind of split-second reflex that matters enormously behind the wheel of a car or crossing a busy street without quite looking both ways. First, or for the overwhelming majority of human history before cars and streets existed at all. Noticing a predator a half-second sooner than the person standing beside you. Toxoplasma infection. Their research found appears to quietly slow that exact reaction, time down a subtle but measurable cost hiding inside an infection. Most people never even know they're carrying the kind of small disadvantage that would have meant very little in a single afternoon, but potentially quite a lot compounded across an entire lifetime and an entire evolutionary history. Here is where rhesus factor enters a story that until this point seemed to have nothing whatsoever to do with blood type. When Flieger's team broke their data down further, sorting participants by rhesus status, a striking pattern emerged. Amongst people free of the parasite entirely, those who were rhesus negative actually showed faster reaction times on average than those who were rhesus positive, a small quiet advantage sitting there with no obvious explanation. But once toxoplasma infection entered the picture, the story flipped. Rhesus-negative individuals infected with the parasite showed some of the steepest reaction time declines measured in the entire study. Heterozygous individuals, the people carrying one copy of each version of the gene rather than 2 matching copies, seemed to be protected from that decline, almost entirely showing barely any slowdown at all, regardless of infection status. Sit with that particular pattern for a moment, because it deserves to be turned over slowly rather than skimmed past on the way to the next paragraph. Rhesus negative on its own, a small reflex advantage, but real vulnerability once infection arrives. Rhesus positive on its own, steadier under infection, but missing that baseline reflex edge entirely. Right in the middle, carrying one copy of each, the advantages of both the vulnerabilities of neither. That is precisely the shape heterozygote advantage is supposed to take the exact fingerprint biologists go looking for when they suspect a gene is being actively maintained by natural selection rather than simply drifting along by chance. Flieger did not stop at reaction times measured in a single laboratory, useful as that first finding was. In 2016, he published a considerably larger piece of research, pulling together rhesus frequency data and disease burden statistics from 65 different countries scattered across every inhabited continent, looking for the same fingerprint at a much larger population-wide scale, rather than one small sample of student volunteers. If heterozygote advantage really was maintaining this trait, he reasoned the burden of disease in a given country should correlate with rhesus genotype frequencies in a very particular predictable direction, running opposite for negative homozygotes compared to positive heterozygotes. That is almost precisely the pattern the data revealed. Country after country, the relationship held in the direction his theory predicted, a pattern considerably harder to write off as simple coincidence once it shows up consistently across 65 separate national populations rather than one small study out of one university department. There is a strange, almost bittersweet postscript worth adding here, one that connects directly back to a story we already spent an entire chapter on earlier tonight. Every calculation Flieger and his colleagues made about the reproductive cost of being rhesus negative rests on decades of historical data collected before a certain quiet injection became routine practice around the world. Now that expecting mothers are in wealthy countries, at least reliably protected from the very complication that once made this trait so costly to carry the original evolutionary pressure, driving this entire puzzle, has largely quietly vanished from the equation for anyone fortunate enough to have access to modern prenatal care. If Flieger is right, and heterozygote advantage really has kept this trait alive for tens of thousands of years by balancing one cost against one benefit, medicine may have just removed one side of that ancient scale entirely sometime in the last 60 years, without evolution having had nearly enough time yet to notice or respond. Now, before this starts sounding like a tidy, fully solved mystery, let me be honest with you about where the actual scientific consensus stands tonight, because that honesty matters more here than almost anywhere else in this entire story. Flieger's hypothesis is taken seriously. It is published in respected peer-reviewed journals, and the pattern he has found has held up across more than one independent study. It is not universally accepted as the final settled word, though, and Flieger himself has never claimed it should be. Other researchers point out that correlation across countries can hide all sorts of tangled, confounding factors, differences in healthcare access, differences in ancestry, differences in how disease burden itself gets measured and reported from one nation's health ministry to another's. Toxoplasma exposure alone is unlikely to be the entire story, even if it turns out to be a real meaningful piece of it. Genetic drift, the quiet chance-driven process we discussed at length in a small mountain range earlier tonight, almost certainly still plays some part too, working alongside whatever selective pressure Flieger has identified, rather than replacing it entirely. Maybe Flieger has found the actual answer, a genuine measurable trade-off between an ancient parasite and a stubborn blood type that nobody thought to look for until he did. Maybe toxoplasma is only one thread among several, a real effect that explains part of the pattern without carrying the whole weight of it alone. Or maybe, and this is the answer that should probably sit with you longest, tonight the honest scientific position in 2026 is still quite simply that nobody fully knows, and the people closest to this research are the first to say so plainly in print without embarrassment. Here is something worth asking yourself, since we are deep enough into tonight's story, now that the question actually means something. Does it bother you even a little that one of medicine's oldest and most personal genetic mysteries still ends honestly in a careful shrug from the very people who study it as their life's profession? Or is there something almost comforting about that, instead a reminder that even now, after everything you have learned across the last several chapters of this story, human blood has not yet finished surprising the people who have spent entire careers trying to fully understand it? Take a second, if you like, and notice which reaction came first for you. I suspect it says something honest about how you tend to sit with uncertainty in other parts of your life too. There is a particular kind of comfort in an honest, unanswered question if you let yourself sit in it rather than rushing past towards something more definite. Every single mystery we have explored together tonight eventually resolved into an answer, a name, a date, a laboratory, a rescued baby. This one has not completely, not yet. And there is something almost reassuring about that, a reminder that the story you are hearing tonight is not simply history being recited from a settled textbook. It is an active, still unfolding question. One actual researchers are still chasing at this exact moment, using tools and ideas nobody in this story, not Levine, not Landsteiner, not even Flieger himself a decade ago, had fully available to them yet. Here's the part of tonight's story where I feel I owe you a small, honest confession as your narrator. When a real scientific mystery stays open this long without being wrapped up neatly, it tends to attract company it did not ask for. People who cannot tolerate an honest maybe start reaching for something more dramatic to fill the space where a clean answer should be. And once you have spent this many minutes tonight learning how remarkably strange and unresolved this particular mystery actually is, straight from careful, peer-reviewed, occasionally quite boring research conducted by people with university appointments and long publication lists, you're in exactly the right position to recognize the difference between a real honest open question and the much wilder stories some corners of the internet have built to answer it. Instead, usually with far more confidence than a single one of tonight's real researchers has ever claimed for their own work. Before we get there though, one more honest thought worth sitting with. Real unresolved mysteries are rare gifts in a world that likes to pretend everything has already been explained somewhere on the internet if you scroll far enough. This one's sitting quietly in the blood of roughly 15 out of every 100 people listening tonight, has not been fully explained anywhere yet by anyone, no matter how many search results might claim otherwise. Every honest mystery eventually attracts a less honest cousin, and this one being both remarkably strange and deeply personal, to roughly 15 out of every 100 people alive has attracted quite a few. So let us talk for a few minutes about the stories the internet tells about this exact blood type, because you have almost certainly encountered at least one of them already, somewhere between a late-night scroll and a strange recommended video, whether you fully realize what you are reading at the time or not. Search this topic on any given evening and you will find claims that rhesus-negative blood did not originate on this planet at all. Entire forums, blog posts, self-published books with dramatic covers, and even the occasional cable television documentary have built a loyal audience around the idea that people carrying this trait descend from something other than ordinary human ancestry, whether that means visitors from elsewhere in the galaxy or a race of ancient engineered beings mentioned in Mesopotamian mythology, or simply something mainstream science, has supposedly been quietly hiding from the public for decades, tucked away in a filing cabinet nobody has ever managed to produce. It is worth understanding this particular phenomenon properly tonight, not because any of it holds up under real careful scrutiny, but because the pattern of how it spreads, who it appeals to, and why it feels so convincing to so many otherwise sensible people actually tells you something true and considerably more interesting about human nature than it tells you about blood, even in the many places where the underlying claim itself does not hold up at all under a single honest look. Before we walk through any of it, let me ask you something, since you have now spent a great deal of tonight learning how a real, careful mystery actually unfolds slowly with citations with honest uncertainty attached. Have you ever noticed how much more satisfying a story feels the moment someone claims it was hidden from you on purpose? An ordinary unanswered question sits there quietly waiting for patient research. A supposedly hidden one feels like a secret you have personally uncovered, and secrets are considerably more fun to share with a friend than open questions are. That single emotional difference, more than any actual evidence, may explain why this next set of ideas has travelled so much further and so much faster than the honest unresolved research we spent our last chapter discussing. Let me walk you through the shape of the theory as it usually appears online, presented the way its believers present it before we take it apart piece by piece, using everything we have already learned together tonight. The starting point almost always leans on a real documented medical fact, the exact one we spent an entire early chapter of this story explaining properly carefully with real names and real dates attached to it. A rhesus-negative mother's body can, under the right circumstances, mount an immune attack against her own rhesus-positive child. Believers in the extraterrestrial origin theory ask a question that sounds reasonable enough on the surface, almost like the kind of honest curiosity we have been encouraging all night. Why would a mother's own body treat her own child as a foreign invader, unless that child, or perhaps the mother herself, carried something truly foreign to begin with? It is a fair question to ask out loud. It simply has a far more grounded answer than the one this particular theory reaches for an answer built from immune cells and inherited antigens rather than distant star systems. From that single twisted reading of a well-understood, thoroughly documented immune mechanism, an entire mythology has grown one detail at a time, each new believer adding one more layer of embellishment on top of the last. One more claim belongs on this list before we move past it, if only because it comes up so consistently that it has become something of a signature line for the entire theory. Believers frequently insist that rhesus-negative individuals cannot be successfully cloned, as though this were an established scientific fact, rather than something nobody has ever actually attempted, tested, or published a single credible finding about. Cloning mammals is difficult and ethically fraught regardless of anyone's blood type, a truly complicated scientific and moral subject on its own merits, and there is no known biological mechanism, none whatsoever, by which the presence or absence of one particular blood antigen would make that process meaningfully harder, easier, or different in any measurable way at all. It is the kind of claim that sounds scientific purely because it borrows scientific vocabulary without a single actual experiment standing behind it anywhere. Attached to that central claim, you will usually find a whole checklist of supposed traits believers associate with rhesus-negative blood: higher than average intelligence, unusually sensitive eyesight and hearing, a body temperature running slightly lower than everyone else's, a strong preference for blue-green or hazel eyes rather than brown, occasional claims of heightened intuition, or a general sense of not quite belonging anywhere, a feeling more than a few of you watching tonight may recognize from an entirely unrelated part of your own life, with nothing to do with blood type at all. Here's a question worth turning over in your own mind for a moment before we go any further. If a list of traits could apply comfortably to nearly anyone listening tonight, curious, a little different from the crowd, occasionally restless, sensitive to things other people miss, does it actually tell you anything meaningful about blood chemistry specifically? Or does it simply describe the ordinary universal experience of being a thoughtful human being who has at some point in an otherwise unremarkable life felt slightly out of step with everyone around them? Psychologists have a name for this trick, incidentally one that has nothing to do with blood at all. It is the same effect that makes a vague horoscope or a fortune cookie or a cold reading at a carnival tent feel eerily personal to almost anyone who reads it. Broad enough language will always find a way to feel like it was written specifically about you personally tonight out of everyone else who has ever heard it. One particular thread woven through this theory deserves special attention because it tries to borrow legitimacy from genuine research we have already covered tonight, and twists it almost beyond recognition in the process. Surveys occasionally circulate online claiming that people who report unusual or unexplained encounters they cannot otherwise account for show up as rhesus negative at rates noticeably higher than the general population. One frequently cited figure repeated across dozens of near-identical websites claims something near double the ordinary rate, a number that sounds precise enough to feel authoritative, right up until you go looking for where it actually came from and find nothing solid waiting at the other end of that search. Set that number beside actual careful research for a moment, the kind of research we spent real patient time with earlier tonight. 65 countries published methodology, formal peer review researchers willing to put their own names on honest uncertainty, rather than reaching for a tidy, satisfying answer, just because a tidy answer would sell better. The surveys behind this particular claim tend to share the same handful of problems. Small sample sizes, sometimes only a few dozen participants. Self-selected respondents, meaning only people already convinced their experience was unusual, chose to fill out the questionnaire in the first place. No independent verification of blood type at all, often nothing more than a respondent typing an answer into an online form from memory. That is not evidence, no matter how many times it gets reposted with a confident headline attached. That is at best an interesting anecdote dressed up in the language of a scientific study, and at worst, a number invented once somewhere by someone, and repeated so often across so many websites quoting each other in a tidy little circle, that repetition alone started to feel like proof. The same way, a rumour in a small town eventually starts sounding like established fact simply because everyone has heard it from someone else who swears it is true. There is a light irony worth pausing on here, and I promise it is meant with affection rather than mockery. since plenty of thoughtful, intelligent people find their way into stories like this one for entirely understandable reasons. A whole online community built partly around feeling special, feeling chosen, feeling biologically set apart from everyone else, in some deep secret way, has spent years quietly ignoring a real scientific finding, sitting right there in plain sight that would have suited that exact same desire beautifully, arguably better than anything a spaceship could offer. You are, if you carry this blood type connected to a genuine evolutionary mystery serious researchers still cannot fully explain, tangled up with an entirely different species of ancient human being sitting on one side of a trade-off between an ancient parasite and a stubborn gene that took a career scientist decades to even begin untangling. That is already a remarkable thing to be part of. It simply happens to be true, which apparently makes it less exciting to some corners of the internet than a story that is not. The deeper mythology surrounding this theory usually reaches even further back than any modern survey all the way into ancient Mesopotamia. A 20th century author working from his own idiosyncratic reading of Sumerian cuneiform tablets proposed that ancient astronauts visited early Mesopotamia thousands of years ago and genetically engineered a portion of humanity to serve them, leaving behind this particular blood trait as a kind of leftover fingerprint. It is worth being plain about where this idea actually stands, since the story has been repeated so many times across so many television specials that it can start to feel like an established alternative viewpoint rather than what it actually is. Professional archaeologists, historians, and linguists who have spent entire careers reading the same ancient cuneiform texts in their original language overwhelmingly reject this particular interpretation. The translations this theory rests on are not accepted by scholars trained to interpret Sumerian and Akkadian, and no physical or genetic evidence, none at all, has ever supported the idea of engineered ancient astronauts appearing anywhere in the human genome, despite decades now of increasingly sophisticated tools capable of finding exactly that kind of signature if it existed. It remains at its core a work of imaginative fiction, published and marketed as non-fiction, that found an audience willing to treat it as forgotten history instead of the creative writing it actually is, none of which means the underlying feeling driving this whole story is entirely without merit, and I want to be careful not to leave that part out. Feeling like your own body has in some sense worked against you is not an irrational thing to feel if you or someone you love has actually endured the disease we spent our first several chapters tonight carefully tracing. There really is something inside a pregnant woman's own body capable of treating her own child as foreign. That part, the strangest part, the part that started this entire theory in the first place, is completely medically true. The mistake was never in noticing that something strange and dramatic is happening inside human blood. The mistake is reaching for a spaceship instead of a placenta to explain it, when the placenta, it turns out, was always the far more interesting answer of the two. Here is where I want to be honest with you about something, since we are far enough into tonight's story now that I think you have earned a little directness from me. The actual scientifically documented explanation for this blood trait, the one we have spent this entire evening carefully building piece by piece, real name by real name, real date by real date, is not a consolation prize handed to you, instead of a more exciting story. A genetic mutation surviving quietly inside our species since long before recorded history began. A gene family so old it predates our own species, entirely carried by a different kind of human being who no longer exists anywhere on this planet. A population in the mountains of Europe carrying a signature found almost nowhere else on the continent. A scientific puzzle so honestly thoroughly unresolved that a working evolutionary biologist in Prague is still actively chasing pieces of it at this exact moment tonight while you listen, publishing careful papers most of the internet will never bother reading all the way through. If you came here looking for a story with real wonder built into it, real uncertainty, real stakes, you already had one several chapters ago, and it never once needed a single spaceship to earn that wonder honestly. So here is a small, gentle challenge for the rest of tonight, and honestly, for whatever you happen to come across online after this video ends too. The next time a claim about blood, about ancestry, about anything at all arrives already dressed in scientific language, take one extra moment before believing it. Ask where the actual study can be found. Ask who reviewed it, and how many people it was tested on, and whether anyone besides the person making the claim has ever managed to reproduce it. Real science, the kind we have spent this entire evening walking through, together almost never arrives, finished tidy and certain. It arrives cautious, footnoted, and more than a little willing to admit what it still does not know. That caution is not a weakness in the story. After tonight, I hope it is starting to feel like the most reassuring part of it. Whatever you personally believe about where this particular blood type first came from, and I suspect most of you listening tonight fell firmly on the side of placentas rather than spaceships. Well before I finish making the argument, there is one thing every single person carrying it shares in common, something that has nothing to do with ancient astronauts, and everything to do with an ordinary Tuesday afternoon at a hospital somewhere near you. This blood is rare. It is valuable in the most literal, practical hospital inventory sense of that word, and in exactly the kind of emergency where nobody has time to ask a single question about where a patient's ancestors came from, or what a stranger on a forum once claimed about their eye colour and their intuition. It may be the only thing standing between someone you love and a very different ending to their story. An ordinary Tuesday afternoon at a hospital is exactly where this story needs to go next, because everything we have covered so far tonight, the history, the science, the ancient cousins, the internet mythology, all of it eventually funnels down into one small, urgent, practical question. When someone is bleeding out on a gurney, seconds mattering more than anything else in the room, and there is no time left to run a single test, what actually goes into that first bag hanging above them, ready before anyone even asks the patient's name? The biology behind the answer is elegant enough to explain in one breath, even after everything else tonight has covered in far greater technical depth. A red blood cell provokes an immune reaction. When it carries a marker the recipient's own body does not recognize as belonging there. Type O. Blood carries neither of the two major markers A or B that most of the population's immune systems are primed and ready to notice. Rhesus negative blood carries none of the marker we have spent this entire evening carefully tracing either. Put those two absences together on a single red blood cell, and you get something near a blank, unremarkable surface, almost nothing there for an unfamiliar immune system to object to compatible, in a genuine emergency, with almost anyone who happens to need it that day, regardless of their own type. There is a mirror version of this same idea worth knowing too, in case the question ever comes up at a dinner party. Type AB, positive blood, carrying every major marker at once, cannot object to any incoming blood type at all, since its own immune system already recognizes all of them as familiar. Doctors call that combination the universal recipient, the quiet opposite twin of everything we have just described, and fittingly enough one of the rarest blood types on the entire planet in its own right. Only somewhere between 6 and 8 out of every 100 people on this planet carry that exact combination, roughly the same order of rarity as the population percentages we spent an entire earlier chapter discussing in a small mountain range in Europe. And a single seriously injured trauma patient, the kind wheeled through an emergency room door after a serious highway accident, can require as many as 100 separate units of blood before the bleeding is finally fully brought under control. Do the arithmetic on that for a moment slowly, because it deserves a moment of real attention rather than a quick nod. One patient, 100 units. A blood type carried by less than 1 in 12 people on the entire planet. It does not take long to understand why hospitals speak about this particular blood type, the way a ship's captain might speak about fresh water on a long voyage, carefully, sparingly, and with real quiet anxiety whenever the supply on hand starts running low. Here's a question worth sitting with before we go any further into how hospitals actually manage this problem. If you had to guess right now which blood type doctors reach for first when a patient arrives with no time to test them, would you assume it is always rhesus negative, the type this entire video has been built around? You would very likely be wrong, along with most people who have never worked inside a blood bank, and the reason why turns out to connect directly back to nearly everything we have already spent tonight learning together, thread by thread, chapter by chapter. In most modern trauma centres across wealthy countries today, the blood actually kept ready and waiting for immediate untested emergencies is type O positive, not O negative at all. A detail that surprises even some people who work in healthcare but outside a blood bank specifically. Type O positive is safer to give than almost anyone assumes, because the antibody most people worry about only becomes dangerous the first time a rhesus negative person's body meets rhesus positive blood and starts building a lasting memory of it. A single emergency transfusion given once to save a life in the moment rarely triggers that kind of lasting sensitization on its own. So hospitals do something quietly practical with their limited precious supply of true O-negative blood. They reserve it specifically for the patients who cannot afford even the small residual risk of sensitization at all. Women of childbearing age. Sit with that for a moment, because it closes a loop that has been running underneath this entire story since the very first few minutes we spent together tonight. The exact reason O-negative blood is guarded so carefully, kept separate, rationed out to a specific group of patients rather than handed out freely to everyone, is the exact same disease we open this whole story with. A candlelit room in Paris, a hospital in New Jersey, a needle in Auckland, a quiet injection that almost erased an entire disease. Hospitals today are still in their own practical, unglamorous way protecting future pregnancies from a danger this video has spent hours carefully explaining simply by deciding who receives which bag of blood first. There is a gentler side to this same careful rationing worth mentioning before we move any further, one that has nothing to do with trauma at all. Blood centres set aside a special category of negative donors screened additionally for a common virus most healthy adults carry without ever noticing specifically to supply transfusions for the most fragile newborns in neonatal intensive care infants whose own immune systems are not yet strong enough to handle blood carrying even an ordinary harmless viral passenger. Some blood centres have taken to calling these particular donors something near to heroes for babies, a slightly sentimental title perhaps, but one that happens to be entirely accurate once you understand exactly what is at stake for the infant on the other end of that donation. It is a fitting, quiet echo of everything this story has already taught you, about how much of modern medicine has been quietly rebuilt one careful decision at a time, around protecting the smallest and most vulnerable patients in any given room, born or not yet born. There is one more wrinkle worth knowing, since we're already deep enough into the practical side of this story to appreciate it properly. Even the phrase universal donor carries a small asterisk most people never hear about. Red blood cells carry dozens of minor markers beyond the ones we have spent tonight discussing, and in rare cases a patient's immune system has already been sensitized to one of those lesser-known markers through a previous transfusion or an earlier pregnancy. In that specific situation, even perfectly matched, O-negative blood can still trigger a reaction. Universal, in other words, means almost universal, a word doctors use with a quiet, practiced humility that the rest of us rarely notice. Nowhere does this entire calculation matter more urgently than on an actual battlefield. And this is where the story of this blood type takes one final remarkable turn tonight. In 2007, a physician assistant named Robert Bloor was serving alongside special forces in Iraq when a badly wounded man was brought to him bleeding internally slowly but steadily from a gunshot wound to the lower abdomen. The helicopter meant to evacuate him to a proper hospital was delayed, the kind of delay that means everything when a body is quietly losing the fight against its own blood loss. Blau had training instincts and every ounce of urgency a person in that situation could summon. What he did not have, sitting on a remote mountaintop with no blood bank for miles in any direction, no refrigerated supply, nothing but a medical kit and his own 2 hands, was a single bag of blood to actually give the man dying in front of him. He watched, unable to stop what was happening, and by his own account, years later, that particular helplessness never fully left him. That single mountaintop became the reason Blau spent the years that followed helping build something the modern military now calls a walking blood bank. A carefully screened roster of soldiers within a unit tested and cleared long before deployment, ready to donate blood directly from their own arm into a wounded comrade's. If the moment ever calls for it, no refrigerator required, no delivery truck, no waiting. The idea itself is not new, even if the formal program built around it is. Whole blood transfusions drawn straight from a willing donor were used on battlefields as far back as the First World War, refined further through the Second World War, Korea and Vietnam, largely abandoned once modern civilian blood banking made component transfusion. Red cells separated from plasma, separated from platelets, the accepted global standard, and then quietly, urgently revived out of pure battlefield necessity in Iraq and Afghanistan decades later, when reality on the ground stopped cooperating with the tidy logistics of a peacetime hospital. Even within a walking blood bank, not just any soldier carrying type O blood automatically qualifies as a donor, which surprises most people hearing about this program for the first time. Military researchers discovered that some type O donors carry unusually high levels of their own naturally occurring antibodies against types A and B antibodies that in large enough quantities can cause a reaction of their own, even inside an otherwise technically compatible recipient. So the modern military tests every potential donor well before deployment screening, specifically for what doctors call low titer, O blood donors, whose antibody levels run low enough to make their whole blood safe for nearly anyone on the receiving end regardless of that person's own blood type. Soldiers who pass that screening carry a card tucked into their gear, identifying them quite literally as a walking, breathing blood bank, a designation most of them carry quietly for an entire deployment and hope, sincerely never to be called upon to use. That system finally proved itself in the most direct, undeniable way possible in the years that followed. A Ranger regiment's own version of this exact program, built specifically around low titer O donors, within its own ranks performed what is now recognized as the first documented point of injury, walking blood bank transfusion on an American service member. A 33-year-old soldier caught in a complex blast injury that tore through soft tissue from his ribs down past his knee, survived an injury that by every ordinary measure available to combat medicine should have killed him well before help ever arrived. Blood drawn from a fellow soldier's arm, transfused within minutes at the exact place he fell, kept him alive long enough to reach a hospital equipped to do the rest. He went home. Ask yourself for a moment how strange and how fitting it is that the very same biological quirk we've spent this entire evening tracing through royal midwives' rabbit experiments and quiet mountain villages in Europe has become in its most modern form something a soldier can quite literally carry inside their own body onto a battlefield, ready to hand to someone else the instant it is needed. No laboratory required, no delay, just one person's own blood becoming in an emergency, the one thing standing between a friend and a very different outcome. If you happen to know your own blood type already, and a good number of you listening tonight almost certainly do by now, let me ask you something small before we move on. When was the last time you actually gave blood rather than simply carrying the knowledge of your own type around? As an interesting fact about yourself, I ask gently, not to guilt anyone listening in the dark tonight, only because so much of tonight's story has been about people who acted on a strange piece of knowledge rather than simply admiring it. Levine sending a sample to a colleague instead of shrugging off a strange reaction. Gorman trusting a textbook sentence enough to test it on his own family. A soldier rolling up a sleeve on a mountaintop because the alternative was watching a friend die with nothing offered in return. Civilian medicine, in its own quieter way, faces a version of this same shortage every single year, without the drama of a battlefield attached to it. Blood centers across wealthy countries regularly issue public appeals when their supply of this particular type dips toward a critical threshold, especially around holidays and summer months, when regular donors tend to travel, get busy, or simply forget. Every single unit collected has an expiration date measured in weeks, not months, which means there is no way to simply stockpile enough for a rainy day, the way you might store canned food in a basement. The supply has to be replenished quietly, constantly, by ordinary people rolling up a sleeve in a school gymnasium or a shopping centre parking lot week after week, whether or not anyone happens to be paying attention that particular week. There is something worth sitting with in the fact that after everything tonight has covered 3.5 centuries of medicine, an entire vanished species, a small mountain population, an unresolved evolutionary puzzle, and a wave of internet folklore built to explain it all away, the story eventually arrives here in the least dramatic setting imaginable. A folding table, a clipboard, a stranger with a needle and a friendly voice asking whether you have eaten today and whether you're feeling well enough to give. No candlelight, no laboratory, no headline. Just an ordinary Tuesday repeated by millions of ordinary people, quietly keeping this entire extraordinary story functioning in the background of everyday life. But none of this, the folding tables, the walking blood banks, the careful rationing between O positive and O negative, tells us anything about where in the world this blood is actually easiest or hardest to find in the first place. Every population we've discussed tonight, that small mountain village, those isolated valleys, carries this trait at wildly different rates, depending on which corner of the planet you happen to be standing in. Some countries can barely keep a single shelf stocked through an ordinary week. Others have so much of this particular blood type circulating naturally through their own population that a shortage barely registers as a concern at all, an entire nation quietly sitting on more of this rare resource than it could ever use. That uneven map, drawn not by hospitals or governments, but by tens of thousands of years of human migration, is exactly where we are headed next. Picture for a moment an ordinary globe sitting on a shelf somewhere, the kind with raised mountain ranges and little dotted lines marking borders that shift more often than the mountains ever do. Now imagine someone could paint that same globe again, not with borders or capital cities, but with a single quiet statistic. How many people out of every 100 standing on any given patch of ground anywhere on the planet carry the exact blood marker we have spent this entire night tracing chapter after chapter, discovery after discovery? The map that would result looks nothing like the one hanging in a classroom. It follows an entirely different set of borders, drawn not by treaties or rivers, but by tens of thousands of years of people simply walking generation after generation further from where our species first began. Start near home for most of you listening tonight in Western Europe, since that is roughly where tonight's story has spent most of its own time so far. Across France, Germany, the United Kingdom, and much of the surrounding regions, somewhere between 15 and 17 out of every 100 people test negative for this marker, a number high enough that most doctors and nurses across the continent treat it as an unremarkable everyday fact of their work. We've already spent an entire earlier chapter tonight inside one particularly striking corner of that same region, a mountain population carrying this trait at rates found almost nowhere else on the planet, their shepherds and their stubborn, beautiful, untranslatable language sitting at the very edge of everything we thought we knew about this part of the world. That story does not need repeating in full again here. It only needs a reminder that Western Europe's numbers are already high compared to the rest of the world. get pulled even higher by a handful of small, historically isolated populations tucked into its most stubborn mountainous corners, populations that quietly refuse to average out neatly, no matter how many times a textbook tries to make them. There is a particular kind of humour worth pausing on here too, gentle rather than mocking, aimed mostly at myself and anyone else who has ever confidently repeated a country-level statistic at a dinner party as though it settled the matter completely. Genetics, it turns out, has very little patience for tidy national summaries. It organises itself along much older, much messier lines, following rivers, mountain ranges and migration routes that existed long before a single flag was ever designed to represent anyone. Now let the globe keep turning south into sub-Saharan Africa, and here is where the story does something most casual retellings get quietly, lazily wrong. Ask yourself something before we go any further into the actual numbers. If someone described an entire continent to you using one single statistic, one tidy percentage meant to represent every country, every ethnic group, every region from coastline to highland, would you trust that number? Or would your instinct tell you something that large and that varied could not possibly be captured so simply? Your instinct would be right. Broadly speaking, rhesus negative frequencies across sub-Saharan Africa tend to run low, often somewhere between 2 and 8 out of every 100 people, considerably lower than the numbers we just walked through in Western Europe. That single broad range, repeated in article after article, textbook after textbook, has a way of flattening an entire continent's worth of genetic history into one forgettable sentence. But broad averages hide real meaningful variation underneath them, the way a single average temperature for an entire country hides the difference between a coastal city and a mountain village experiencing that exact same day very differently. Ethiopia offers one of the clearest, best documented examples of exactly why that distinction matters. A careful study examining both highland and nilotic populations within the country found nearly 19 out of every 100 people testing rhesus negative, a figure dramatically higher than what earlier less thorough surveys had reported for the region, and higher, in fact, than the overall Western European average we just discussed a moment ago. One single country sitting inside a continent most casual conversation treats as a single genetic block, quietly outperforming an entire other continent on this particular measure. That single detail deserves to sit with you for a moment longer than most facts we've covered tonight, because it says something true about nearly every broad statement anyone ever makes about an entire continent, an entire country, or, honestly, an entire group of people of any kind. Averages describe populations. They rarely describe the specific particular place any one person actually comes from. It is worth remembering too that the same reasoning applies just as firmly to the highland and nilotic communities inside that one Ethiopian study. Two groups with their own distinct histories, migrations, languages and genetic patterns sitting inside the borders of a single modern nation, almost by administrative accident of where a line was eventually drawn on a colonial-era map. Even a country-level number as useful as it is for a hospital, planning its blood supply is still a kind of average hiding smaller, truer stories underneath it. Keep the globe turning east now all the way to East Asia and the numbers fall off a cliff entirely. In Japan, roughly 1 out of every 200 people tests rhesus negative. Among ethnically Chinese populations in Hong Kong, the figure runs even lower, closer to 1 in 400. Korea sits in that same narrow range. Compare that to Western Europe's 15 to 17 out of every 100, and you're looking at a difference measured not in small percentage points, but in an entirely different order of magnitude altogether, the kind of gap that turns a routine European blood drive into a genuine scientific curiosity the moment it happens to visit a hospital in Osaka or Seoul instead. There is a technical wrinkle buried inside those East Asian numbers worth knowing properly, since it is the kind of detail that rarely makes it into a casual conversation about blood type, and it happens to be one of the more elegant pieces of nuance in this entire story. Some of the people who test rhesus negative using an ordinary everyday blood test in East Asia are not actually missing the gene entirely. They carry what researchers call a weak partial version of it, a faint genetic echo detectable only through more specialized laboratory methods, a kind of quiet, incomplete presence that an ordinary test simply is not sensitive enough to catch at all. Roughly 1 in every 3 or 4 people testing rhesus negative in parts of East Asia actually falls into this particular category once specialists go looking for it properly. Once you account for that distinction, the true complete absence of this gene, the kind carried by most rhesus negative people across Europe, turns out to be rarer still across East Asia than even those already startling numbers first suggest. One more stop belongs on this particular tour before we ask what any of it actually means, and it takes us to the far side of the planet from where tonight's story first began. Among indigenous populations across the Americas, from the Arctic reaches of northern Canada down through the entire length of South America, this trait grows rarer, still often approaching numbers too small to register as anything but a rounding error in a careful population survey. If you have been quietly doing the geographic math in your head, as we have moved from continent to continent tonight, you may already sense exactly where this particular pattern is heading, and you would be entirely right to sense it. Every one of these regional differences traces back to the same underlying process repeated across different corners of the world, with different outcomes each time depending entirely on which small group of travellers happen to be involved and what they happen to be carrying with them. Thousands of years ago, small founding groups of people began moving outward from populations that had stayed together in one place for a very long stretch of time, carrying with them only a fraction of the total genetic variation available in the wider group they were leaving behind. Purely by chance, whichever version of any given gene happened to be carried by the specific individuals who made a particular journey is the version that got passed down to every single descendant of that journey for every generation that followed, for as long as that new population remained relatively separate from everyone else. A small group crossing into the far northeast of Asia and eventually onward into the Americas carrying by pure chance almost none of this particular gene variant among them would produce exactly the pattern we still see today. Tens of thousands of years and countless generations later, essentially undiluted by any later larger wave of migration that ever fully reversed it. Geneticists have far more technical language for all of this, terms like founder effect and genetic drift phrases you may even recognize from a small mountain range. We discussed several chapters ago tonight working here on a scale of entire continents rather than one isolated valley. But there is a simpler way to picture the whole idea that has nothing to do with technical vocabulary at all, and I find it helps the concept settle properly in a way the formal terms sometimes do not. Imagine an enormous well-stocked library, thousands of books lining every shelf, representing the full genetic variety carried by a large, long-established population. Now, imagine a small group of travellers sets out to found a new settlement, somewhere distant, and rather than packing the entire library, they can only carry a single small box of books with them, whichever titles happened to be closest at hand the morning they left. Every library that grows from that new settlement, every book copied and passed down to every child born there for generations afterward, traces back to only what fit inside that one small box. Nothing wrong happened. No book was better or worse than any other. It is simply what was standing nearest the door on a particular morning thousands of years ago that ended up shaping an entire library's contents for every generation that followed. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment, since we're near enough to the end of tonight's journey that it deserves real thought rather than a quick answer. Does knowing that your own blood type traces back to nothing more meaningful than which travellers happen to be standing closest to the door on a particular morning, thousands of generations ago, make the whole story feel smaller to you? Or does it make it feel in its own strange way even larger. A trait this personal sitting quietly in your own veins tonight, shaped entirely by an accident of geography and timing, far older than written language itself, older than most of the borders on that ordinary classroom globe we started this chapter with. Stop and consider for just a moment everyone who has ever loved you, going back further than any family tree you could actually draw from memory. Parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and further back still thousands upon thousands of ordinary people. You will never know a single name for standing in fields and forests and coastlines across an entire planet, most of them never travelling more than a few days' walk from wherever they were born. Somewhere in that impossibly long, impossibly quiet chain, a small number of them packed up what little they could carry and walked toward a horizon nobody in their family had ever seen before. Whatever blood type you happen to carry tonight is the direct unbroken result of exactly which of your ancestors did that and which of them stayed home instead. This uneven map carries real practical consequences today, ones worth connecting directly back to the blood banks and hospitals we spent our last chapter tonight inside. A country where this trait sits at roughly 1 in 400 faces an entirely different logistical reality than one where it sits at nearly 1 in 6. Some nations maintain such thin domestic reserves of this exact blood type that a single unusual surge in demand, a mass casualty event, an unusually difficult surgical season can seriously strain what little local supply exists to begin with. International rare blood registries have grown up specifically to answer this problem. Quiet networks connecting blood banks across national borders, staffed by people who spend entire careers tracking down a handful of rare donors scattered across dozens of countries, occasionally flying a single precious unit across an entire ocean because the one patient who needs it happens to reside somewhere. This particular trait almost never occurs naturally at all. The map we have just drawn together tonight is not simply an academic curiosity fit for a textbook. Somewhere on this exact night in a hospital on the far side of whichever screen you happen to be watching this from, that map is quietly determining how quickly a patient can get exactly what their own body needs to keep going. We have now travelled the entire distance of this particular map together from a single mountain range holding the highest concentration of this trait, found anywhere on Earth, all the way to entire continental regions where it barely registers at all, and yet standing back from all of it, from every country, every percentage, every careful correction, to a lazy average one enormous question, still sits quietly, patiently unanswered, underneath the whole map. Every single one of these regional differences describes where this trait ended up. Not one of them explains where it actually began in the first place, before any human being had ever taken a single step toward anywhere. That is the very last thread left dangling in tonight's entire story, and it happens to be quite fittingly the oldest thread of them all, older than any date, any doctor, any nation we have discussed across every previous chapter. Everything else we have covered tonight, the discoveries, the treatments, the population patterns, the folklore, sits on top of one original quiet moment, somewhere in deep human history, when a single strand of genetic material first changed in one person in one place, for reasons nobody fully understands even now. Every mountain village, every hospital blood bank, every soldier's screening card, every internet theory we picked apart earlier tonight, all of it traces back to that one original unremarkable moment. It is time finally to go looking for it. Every trail has to start somewhere, and this one, the longest and strangest thread we have followed all night, starts further back than any human record could ever reach on its own. Geneticists studying the deep history of this exact mutation, the small quiet deletion in a single gene that started this entire story, place its earliest known appearance somewhere in Africa, more than 100,000 years ago, long before agriculture, long before writing, long before anyone alive, today's ancestors, had even begun the slow scattered walk toward every other continent we visited together tonight. Say that number out loud for a moment slowly, because it deserves to actually land rather than simply pass by. 100,000 years. Modern humans had not yet reached Europe. The Neanderthals we spent an entire chapter with tonight were very much still alive, hunting and raising families across an Ice Age landscape none of us would recognize today. Written language was still tens of thousands of years away. The wheel, the pyramids, the first cities, every single date we have mentioned across this entire video, all of it belongs to the last sliver of that timeline, a thin, bright edge sitting at the very end of a much longer, much quieter darkness. Somewhere in that distant, almost unimaginable stretch of time, in one single person, in one single unremarkable moment nobody could have known mattered at all. A small piece of genetic code quietly changed. It carried no name. It caused no headline. It simply began travelling quietly, patiently, folded inside every descendant of that one original person, waiting more than 98,000 years for anyone alive to even notice it was there. Here is a question worth carrying with you into the quiet stretch of story we have left together tonight. Somewhere between that first quiet change in Africa and this exact moment, this exact video, this exact sentence reaching you in the dark, how many people do you imagine actually carried this same invisible marker without a single one of them ever learning its name? Thousands, certainly. Almost certainly millions spread across 100,000 years, and every single continent this trait eventually reached on every possible side of every migration we traced together earlier tonight. Entire lifetimes unfolded beginning to end. Entire families raised, entire quiet tragedies endured and quietly misunderstood, all wrapped around one piece of biology nobody had a word for until an ocean, a monkey, and a very patient rabbit finally gave it one less than 100 years ago. Now a blink of an eye against everything that came before it. We have spent tonight walking that exact unlikely path together, so let us walk back through it once more, gently, the way you might flip slowly through old photographs before finally closing the album for the night. It began for us tonight in a candlelit room in Paris with a royal midwife named Louise Bourgeois watching two newborn twins die of a disease with no name at all in the year 1609 and writing it down anyway, because that was simply the kind of person she was. It carried us across an ocean and 3 centuries to a hospital in New Jersey, where a young mother's own blood turned against a transfusion from her own husband, and where 2 careful doctors, Levine and Stetson, refused to simply write the whole strange episode off as bad luck. It took us to a laboratory in New York where an aging Nobel laureate and his young Brooklyn-born partner injected rabbits with a monkey's blood and stumbled almost by accident into naming a factor they would later discover they had only half understood. It carried us to Boston, where a young pediatrician named Louis Diamond looked at 3 tragedies everyone else had already filed under 3 separate names, and quietly, patiently proved they were one. It took us to Auckland, where a physiologist turned obstetrician named William Liley followed one misplaced needle into an idea so unlikely his own colleagues assumed at first that he had lost his mind and reached a baby still weeks away from its own first breath. It brought us to a hospital in New Jersey once more, decades later, where a doctor reading an ordinary textbook late one evening found a single sentence strange enough to test on his own family, and very nearly erased an entire disease from the wealthy world in the process. Then the story turned stranger still. It took us into the mountains of the Pyrenees to a woman named Amaya, and a language nobody has ever managed to give a single relative, and a population carrying this exact trait in numbers found nowhere else on the continent. It reached backward impossibly into the blood of an entirely different species of human being, one that stopped existing tens of thousands of years before any of the rest of this story began, yet still shows up quietly in genomes being studied in laboratories today, and in the blood of people alive on the far side of the planet, who have never once thought about Neanderthals in their entire time on this earth. It sat with an honest, unresolved scientific puzzle in Prague one nobody, including the very careful scientists chasing it, has fully solved yet. It waded briefly and necessarily into the stories the internet tells when an honest mystery starts to feel too quiet for its own good, and found real truth waiting patiently underneath the noise the whole time, and it landed finally in the most ordinary places imaginable: a folding table at a blood drive, a soldier's screening card on a battlefield, a hospital's careful practical decision about which patient receives which bag first, and at the very end of our journey together an entire uneven map of the world itself, drawn by nothing more dramatic than which of our ancestors happened to walk furthest from home. Every single one of those chapters, every doctor, every accident, every misplaced needle, and misread textbook was really just one long argument with the same original quiet mutation, the one that began, as best anyone can currently tell, somewhere in Africa, more than 100,000 years before any of them were ever born. History did not invent this mystery. History simply kept slowly, imperfectly catching up to it. If you are one of the roughly 15 out of every 100 people watching this story reach its end tonight, sit with that timeline for just a moment before we let it rest. The marker sitting quietly in your blood right now is not a 20th century discovery wearing an old-fashioned name. It is closer to the oldest possession you actually own, older than your family's language, older than the country on your passport, older than agriculture itself, passed down to you across roughly 4,000 generations of people who never once heard the word rhesus, and who never needed to because their bodies were already quietly carrying the whole story regardless. And if you are one of the other 85 out of every 100 carrying the more common version, instead the story still belongs to you every bit as fully, and I hope you never once felt like a spectator watching someone else's mystery tonight. You have spent tonight learning the biography of the family. Your own blood exists in direct relation to the counterpart. It silently measures itself against every single time a mother and a child happen to meet for the first time in a delivery room somewhere on this planet. Nobody watching tonight walked away from this story as a bystander. Every single one of you is standing somewhere inside it, whether the letters on your own chart happen to include that one small stubborn minus sign or not. Before we let this story rest for the night, one last thread deserves a place in it because it points somewhere this whole history has never actually been before. In 2022, researchers in the United Kingdom working across the National Health Service's blood service and universities in Bristol and Cambridge did something no one in this entire story, not Landsteiner, not Diamond, not Liley, ever had the tools to attempt. They took stem cells, grew them carefully in a laboratory over several weeks, coaxed them into becoming fully formed red blood cells, and transfused a small, careful amount of that laboratory-grown blood into a human volunteer for the very first time in medical history. The immediate goal of that first careful trial was modest and specific testing, whether cells grown outside a human body might last longer in circulation and behave more predictably than blood collected the ordinary way from an ordinary donor. The longer goal, the one worth sitting with a little longer tonight, is considerably larger and considerably more moving once you have spent this many hours understanding exactly what shortage has always meant for this particular blood type. If laboratory-grown blood eventually becomes reliable and affordable at scale, it could someday mean a steady manufactured supply of exactly the rarest blood types, the ones we spent an entire earlier chapter tonight learning to ration so carefully without ever needing another folding table, another blood drive, another anxious call to an international rare blood registry at all. We are not there yet. That much needs saying plainly, in keeping with a promise this video has tried to honour all night long, ever since a French midwife's careful notes turned out to be the honest, unglamorous beginning of everything that followed. The research is early, the trial size is tiny, and the road between one careful laboratory experiment and a genuine worldwide solution is long enough that nobody serious working in that field is claiming otherwise, least of all the researchers themselves. But it is worth noticing one final time tonight how familiar that particular shape feels by now, after everything else we have walked through together. A small, careful, almost unremarkable first step taken by a handful of people willing to try something nobody had managed before them, quietly setting the stage for whatever comes next, whether anyone watching happens to notice at the time or not. We have watched that exact pattern repeat itself in one form or another across every single chapter of tonight's story. A midwife willing to write something down, a doctor willing to test a hunch on his own family, a soldier willing to roll up a sleeve on a mountaintop. History. It turns out rarely announces its turning points with fanfare. Mostly it just quietly hands the next small stubborn person a reason to keep going. So here finally is where an entire night of careful, honest storytelling actually leaves us. We know with real confidence what this trait is, how it behaves, and how a century of remarkable, occasionally accidental doctors learned first to survive it, and then very nearly to erase its worst danger completely. We know a great deal about where it can be found on this planet today, and a considerable amount about how it got there. What we still do not know, not completely, not with the kind of tidy certainty this story has earned the right to want, is the exact reason evolution allowed it to survive at all generation after generation for 100,000 years against every ordinary rule that should have quietly erased it long before any of us were born to ask the question. Maybe an evolutionary biologist in Prague already holds the largest piece of that final answer, waiting on further evidence to confirm it properly. Maybe the true answer is still sitting undiscovered in a piece of ancient bone nobody has excavated yet, or a pattern nobody has thought to look for. Or maybe, and I think this is the honest note worth ending on tonight, some mysteries are simply built to outlast the people, curious enough to keep chasing them generation after generation, the same way this one has outlasted every single person who has ever carried it before you. That uncertainty is not a flaw in tonight's story, and I hope after everything we have covered together tonight you have come to see it that way too, rather than as an unfinished ending. After everything we have walked through together, I hope it feels like the most honest possible place to land, and maybe even a strangely comforting one. Real science, the kind this entire story has tried to honour from its very first minute, rarely hands you a door that closes all the way behind it. Mostly, if you're patient and careful, and willing to keep looking long after everyone else has stopped it, hands you a slightly larger room instead, with a few more doors of its own quietly waiting inside. Wherever you're listening from tonight, and whichever side of that 15 out of every 100 you happen to fall on, I hope some part of you carries this particular story a little differently than you carried it before tonight began. The next time a nurse asks a quiet question before a blood donation. The next time you notice a small ordinary injection mentioned on a pregnancy chart without anyone explaining why. The next time you overhear someone online insisting their blood came from somewhere among the stars. I hope some quiet part of you remembers the truth was already stranger, older, and considerably more moving than that resting the entire time in a candlelit room in Paris, a laboratory in New York, a mountain village in the Pyrenees, and if you happen to carry it in your own two arms right now. Thank you truly for spending an entire evening of your life inside this particular story tonight. Staying this long through every doctor, every accident, every century, every quiet detour into a mountain village or a laboratory or a battlefield is its own quiet kind of gift, and I do not take a single minute of it lightly. If tonight gave you even a few minutes of real rest, alongside everything it also happened to teach you, that was always the whole point of being here together in the first place. If you're ready to rest your eyes now, this is a good, gentle place to let go. And if your mind is still wandering, still turning a few of tonight's names and dates over one more time before sleep finally arrives, that is all right too. Let it wander wherever it wants to go. There is nothing waiting to be caught up on. Only the next story whenever you're ready for it sitting quietly for you, the same patient way this one did before you ever pressed play. Rest well tonight, sleep deeply, and I will see you again next time.